I grew up an only child, my sister said into the microphone. I was sitting 10 feet away from her. For half a second, the reception room went so quiet that I could hear a fork touch a plate somewhere behind me. Then my father pushed back his chair and stood, and we couldn't have asked for a better daughter. My mother lifted her champagne glass with a smile. 3 relatives at the table beside mine turned their heads and looked straight at me. Lydia saw them do it. She saw me too. Her eyes met mine for one deliberate beat before she turned back toward her new husband. That was when I knew she had not misspoken. Before anyone else could decide whether to laugh, object, or pretend they had heard nothing, Thomas Mercer, the groom's father, reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "That's strange," he said. "Your other daughter called me 3 weeks ago, and I saved what she sent me. My name is Allison Reed, and by the time my sister erased me from our family in front of a room full of people, I had already learned that the most dangerous lies are rarely the ones told for the first time. I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from, because this story gets much bigger than one cruel wedding speech. Stay with me, because what Thomas had saved on that phone was connected to something Lydia never expected anyone outside our family to question, and what happened afterward changed her marriage, her business, and the way our parents had spent years explaining me away. If stories about family secrets, consequences, and people finally being forced to answer for their choices are your kind of stories, subscribe to the channel and stay with me to the end. I did not stand up. That seemed to bother Lydia more than if I had. Her fingers tightened around the microphone, and the smile she had been wearing changed at the edges. I had known my sister for 30 years. I knew the difference between her real smile, her nervous smile, and the polished expression she used when a meeting stopped going according to plan. This was the third one. Grant turned toward her first, not toward me, toward his wife. "What is he talking about?" Lydia gave a short laugh. "Not now." Thomas remained seated, his phone resting in his palm. My father looked from him to me. His face hardened so quickly that I almost admired the efficiency of it. Allison. There it was, my name. Apparently I existed again when they needed someone to blame. I put my champagne glass on the table. 3 nights earlier, Thomas had sent me a short status update. His team had confirmed that 2 project documents were different. The affected work was still on hold. The review was not finished. He had not told me who had changed anything, whether he believed it was deliberate or what action his company intended to take. I had not asked. That mattered. Grant looked at me. "What did you send my father?" "Something about a project," I said. He confirmed the versions were different. Anything beyond that is his review to explain. Lydia's face changed again. "Of course you'd say that." I looked at her. "Say what?" "Make it sound official. That's what you do. You take something small, put it in writing, and suddenly everybody thinks it's a crisis." Around us, guests had stopped pretending not to listen. I could feel the attention moving across the room, but I wasn't embarrassed anymore. Embarrassment requires some uncertainty about whether you belong where you're standing. I had spent enough years questioning that. Grant lowered his voice. "Are you actually sisters?" Lydia inhaled sharply. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Half this room knows who I am. One of my mother's cousins stared down at her plate. My Aunt Susan, seated 2 tables away, looked openly furious. Dad stepped closer. "This is Lydia's wedding. Whatever stunt you're pulling can wait." I didn't bring it into the room. "You called his father 3 weeks ago." Dad opened his mouth. Thomas spoke before he could. "William, I was the one who brought it into the room tonight." That shut him up for exactly 2 seconds. Then Mom rose, still holding the champagne flute she had lifted to toast the only daughter she apparently remembered having. "Can we please not do this here?" I looked at her. That sentence had been the soundtrack of my childhood. "Not here. Not tonight. Don't upset your father. Don't embarrass your sister. Don't make a scene." The location changed. The rule never did. Thomas stood. "Grant, Allison, Lydia, we should speak somewhere private." Lydia shook her head. "There is nothing to discuss tonight." Thomas looked at her. "Then it should be a short conversation." I pushed my chair back. Dad caught my arm lightly above the elbow. I looked down at his hand. He released me. I didn't say a word. That was another thing my family never understood about me. Silence did not always mean submission. Sometimes it meant I had already decided the conversation wasn't worth having. I followed Thomas toward a small lounge off the main reception hall. Grant came behind us. Lydia had no choice but to follow without making the scene she had spent years accusing me of creating. The door closed behind us, muting the music from the ballroom. Grant spoke first. "Dad." Thomas slipped his phone back into his jacket. The work Allison contacted me about was put on hold the day after she called. Grant stared at him. "What work?" Lydia answered before Thomas could. "The hotel renovation. It's a technical disagreement. That's all." Grant turned to her. "You knew about this?" "Of course I knew about the project. My company is working on it." "That's not what I asked." Lydia folded her arms. Thomas looked at me. "Allison sent me several documents. I asked my project team to verify them independently." I kept my eyes on him. "Did they verify the documents were different?" "Yes." Lydia exhaled loudly. "Because they're different documents. One is an engineering note. The other is an owner summary. A summary is not supposed to reproduce every sentence from an engineering record." I said nothing. That answer was important. A few minutes earlier, Lydia had acted as if I had invented a crisis. Now she was explaining why the discrepancy existed. Grant noticed it too. I saw it in the way he looked at her. "What was missing?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. I stepped in before Lydia could accuse him of turning the wedding into a board meeting. "That's part of his review. I'm not going to litigate it in a bridal lounge." Lydia gave me a sharp look. "How noble." "No. Appropriate." She laughed without humor. "You always do this. You make everyone else sound irrational while you sit there acting like you're the only adult in the room. Then let's keep it simple." "Did you send me the files?" Grant looked between us. Lydia's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Did I tell you I had concerns?" "You're always concerned." "Did I tell you I couldn't agree with the way the issue was being treated?" "You gave an opinion." "Did I tell you I would contact the owner if the hold wasn't confirmed?" Her eyes flicked toward Thomas. That was the first time she stopped answering immediately. Grant saw that too. "Lydia?" She turned on me. "You had no right to bring my business into my wedding. I contacted Thomas 3 weeks before your wedding. You knew he was going to be my father-in-law. I contacted the person representing the owner of the project. You could have called me. I did. You could have called Grant. Grant doesn't run the project." Grant glanced at his father. Thomas gave the smallest nod. Lydia looked furious, but anger had always been easier for her than answering a question she didn't like. Dad opened the door without knocking. Mom was behind him. Of course they had followed us. Dad looked at me first. "Apologize." Grant actually blinked. I said, "For what? For this?" He waved one hand around the room as if I had personally constructed it, invited everyone into it, and locked the doors. "For interfering with your sister's business. For embarrassing her in front of her husband's family. For whatever you sent Thomas. You don't know what I sent him. I know you." "No, Dad. You know the version of me that's convenient when Lydia needs defending." Mom stepped between us. "Please, not tonight." I looked at her. "You stood up out there and toasted a woman who had just told a room full of our relatives that she was an only child." I didn't stand up. That was my mother. Accuracy arriving exactly where accountability should have been. You raised your glass. It was her wedding. And I'm your daughter every other Saturday? Her expression tightened. This is exactly what Lydia meant. That almost got me. Not because it hurt. Because it was so perfect. They had erased me publicly, then treated my objection as proof that erasing me had been justified. I looked at Thomas, then Grant. "I've said everything I need to say tonight." Lydia scoffed. "So now you're leaving after blowing everything up?" "No. I'm leaving because this is your wedding, and I have no interest in spending another hour being blamed for a conversation your father-in-law started after you told everyone I didn't exist." Dad stepped toward me again. I held up one hand. "Don't." He stopped. "I wasn't 22 anymore. I didn't work for him. I didn't live in his house. I hadn't accepted money from my parents in years. I had my own car outside, my own hotel room 10 minutes away, and my own career that had nothing to do with whether William Reed approved of me. That was why I had come to the wedding in the first place. Not because I needed them. Because I refused to let my absence become another story they could tell about me. I walked out of the lounge and returned to my table long enough to pick up my bag. Aunt Susan touched my wrist. "You okay?" "I will be." She glanced toward the hallway. That was disgusting. I squeezed her hand. "Not tonight." The phrase made both of us smile, despite everything. Then I left. By the time I reached my hotel, I already knew the wedding would become the version everyone remembered. The speech, Thomas pulling out his phone, Grant discovering his new wife had a sister she had somehow managed to make sound imaginary. But the wedding was not where the story began. It began 4 weeks earlier, on a Saturday morning in May, with an email from Lydia that I nearly deleted without opening. The subject line said, "Quick favor." The message underneath was even shorter. 10 minutes. That's all I need. Tell me if I'm reading this engineer too conservatively. There were 3 attachments. An engineering note, an owner-facing project summary, and a schedule extract. I stared at her name at the top of the email longer than I stared at the attachments. Lydia and I were not close. We hadn't been close in years. She had spent enough family dinners describing me as rigid, negative, and incapable of letting anything go that I had stopped bothering to defend myself. My parents agreed with her often enough that the 4 of us had settled into an arrangement that almost worked. They didn't ask for my approval. I didn't offer it. Then, every once in a while, someone needed something I was good at. That was when I became family again. I ran a small risk and safety compliance consulting company. Most of my work was unglamorous by design. I read what people skipped. I compared what had been approved with what people were actually planning to do. I asked why a requirement had disappeared between one version and the next. The best days in my profession were the days when nothing happened because somebody had caught the problem before it became an incident. Lydia hated that philosophy. She preferred momentum. Clients loved her for it. Dad adored her for it. I clicked the first attachment anyway. Not because she was my sister, because she had asked a professional question, and I could answer one without reopening the rest of our relationship. The engineering note was several pages long. I read it once. Then again, more slowly. One section concerned temporary support in an area scheduled for upcoming work. The language wasn't dramatic. Engineers rarely write dramatic sentences when a precise one will do. The affected work was not to proceed until the temporary support condition had been confirmed and the hold released. Simple. Clear. I opened Lydia's owner summary. Most of the language matched the engineering note in substance. Schedule pressure. Coordination. Review items. Nothing immediately alarming. Then I reached the section covering the affected work. I went back to the engineering note, then back to the summary. I opened both documents side by side. The hold condition was gone. Not softened. Not paraphrased. Gone. I checked the schedule extract last. The affected work was still sitting in the Tuesday start sequence immediately after Memorial Day. I leaned back from my desk and read all 3 attachments again because the first rule of my profession was not to fall in love with your first conclusion. Maybe another document released the hold. Maybe Lydia had sent me an incomplete set. Maybe the summary was never intended to guide a schedule decision. There were several innocent explanations, and I wanted one of them to be true. Then I noticed the version information. I had been saving version numbers since my 20s. Lydia used to make fun of me for it. "Do you save drafts of your grocery lists too?" she'd once asked. Sometimes I did. But version numbers tell you what changed. More importantly, they tell you when. I pulled Lydia's email back onto the screen and looked at the timestamp, the attachment names, and the sequence of the files she had sent me herself. Then I returned to the sentence in the engineering note that did not appear in the owner summary. That missing sentence was the reason I called Thomas Mercer. I did not call Thomas that morning. That would have been easy to justify later, which was exactly why I refused to do it before I understood what I was looking at. A missing safety condition in an owner summary could mean several things, and some of them were ordinary. Maybe the summary had been prepared before the engineer issued the latest note. Maybe the hold had already been released in a document Lydia had not sent me. Maybe the person who wrote the summary had assumed the owner did not need every technical condition repeated because the contractor already had the full engineering package. Those possibilities did not make the omission harmless, but they did mean I had no right to jump from discrepancy to accusation. I went back to the engineering note and read the relevant section for the third time. The wording was dry and specific. Temporary support in the affected area had to be confirmed before the next phase of work proceeded, and the hold was to remain in place until that confirmation was documented. It did not say the building was about to collapse. It did not say anyone was in immediate danger. It said there was a condition that had to be satisfied before work moved forward, which in my world was enough. Safety systems are not built around waiting until something looks dramatic. Then I opened Lydia's summary again. The section about that area mentioned coordination, sequencing, and schedule sensitivity. It acknowledged that engineering review was ongoing. What it did not say was that the work could not proceed until the hold was formally released. That difference mattered because summaries influence decisions. Owners read them, project managers read them, schedulers use them. If the technical document says do not proceed until confirmed, and the summary says coordination ongoing, the second version makes the first one sound optional. I checked the attachment properties Lydia had sent. They were exported copies, not live project files. That was normal. Her contract allowed her to use outside technical and compliance consultants for limited review, and she had sent me owner-distributable extracts, which meant I was not looking at anything I had obtained improperly. Just as important, I had no credentials to the Mercer project platform. I could read what Lydia had sent me, but I could not alter anything inside the system where those documents had been created. I wrote her an email instead of calling. I need more context before I can give you the answer you're looking for. The engineering note contains a hold condition that does not appear in the owner summary. I would not treat that as a minor wording difference. Before the affected work proceeds, someone needs to confirm that the hold has been formally released and that the owner-facing summary reflects the current status. I read it twice before sending. No accusation, no mention of fraud, no sentence that said Lydia had done anything wrong. Then I added one more question. Who is responsible for confirming release of the hold? I sent it and went to make coffee. My phone rang before the machine finished brewing. Lydia. Of course. She rarely called when an email would do unless she wanted the conversation to become harder to quote later. That did not automatically mean bad intent. Some people hated written communication. Lydia loved it when the message was good news. I answered, "Hi. You made that sound way more serious than it is." "No, hello." I leaned against the kitchen counter. I described what's in the documents. "It's a summary, Allison." "I know. So why are you acting like somebody deleted a safety order?" "I'm not. You literally said the hold condition isn't there." "It isn't." She let out a breath that carried more irritation than air. Because the owner summary isn't the engineering package. Nobody is relying on that one page to run the site. Then, what are they relying on to know whether the hold is released? The team knows. That's not what I asked. There was a pause. She hated yes or no questions when she wanted room to move. Engineering is reviewing it. Has the hold been released? You're doing the thing. What thing? The interrogation. I looked at the coffee machine. You asked for my opinion. I asked if you thought the engineer was being too conservative. And I told you I can't answer that from what you sent. You can never just say, yeah, this is probably fine. Not when I don't know that it's fine. Another breath. This is why nobody likes asking you for help. That landed exactly where she intended it to, but not hard enough to change my answer. Then don't ask. See? That's what I mean. What do you want from me, Lydia? I want you to look at it like a normal person, instead of someone waiting for a disaster. A normal person shouldn't be the standard for a hold release. You always have to make everything sound official. And you always call me when you need an official opinion, then get mad when it isn't convenient. She went quiet. I knew I had gone sharper than necessary. that was one of my less attractive habits. I had spent enough years being told that my tone mattered more than the content that, eventually, I had stopped caring whether people found me pleasant. It protected me from some things. It also gave Lydia material she had used against me for years. She said, "You're still exactly the same. So are the documents." "Fine, forget I asked." She ended the call. I stood there for another minute, listening to the coffee machine click off. Then I went back to my desk and sent a second email, just confirming our call. My understanding is that the engineering hold has not yet been confirmed as released. My recommendation remains that the owner summary preserve that condition clearly, and that the affected work not proceed until release is documented. If I misunderstood anything from our conversation, please correct me in writing. That was not me trying to trap my sister. That was how I worked. People remember conversations differently, especially after something goes wrong. I had learned a long time ago that one calm follow-up email could save 6 months of argument about who said what. Lydia used to mock me for it when we worked around Dad's company. "You document breathing," she'd once said. "Only if someone bills for it," I had replied. At the time, we had both laughed. That was before every habit of mine became evidence that I was difficult. By Monday afternoon, Lydia still had not corrected my recap email. She had not confirmed that the hold had been released either. Instead, my father called. I saw his name on the screen and almost let it go to voicemail. I answered because there was still a small, stupid part of me that hoped he might ask what the technical issue actually was. He didn't. "What did you say to Lydia?" I closed the spreadsheet I had been working on. "Good afternoon to you too. She says you're threatening to interfere with the Mercer project." "I haven't threatened anyone. She says you're going over her head." "I haven't contacted anyone outside her company. Yet." There it was. I leaned back in my chair. "Did she show you the engineering note?" Dad gave a dismissive sound. "I don't need to read every piece of paper to know how you operate." "Then you don't know what we're talking about." "I know you see danger everywhere." "No, I see requirements where they're written. Same difference with you." I stared out my office window. 8 years earlier, I had sat across from him in a conference room above his old renovation office and listened to almost the same speech. That project had involved a subcontractor preparing to continue work before a required documentation issue was resolved. I had asked for a hold. Dad had fought me on it for 2 days, because a client was already angry about delays. Eventually, the documentation was corrected, the work resumed, and nobody got hurt. Dad had used the absence of an accident as proof that I had overreacted. "Nothing happened," he'd told me afterward, "because we stopped. You cost us a client." The work was wrong. The client didn't agree. The requirement wasn't theirs to waive. That had been the beginning of the end for me at the family company. The story changed over time. At first, Dad said I had been too rigid. Then he said I had panicked. Eventually, at family dinners, it became the project Allison nearly ruined because she couldn't handle pressure. Lydia had been 22 then, still learning the business. She heard every version. Now Dad said, "You did this before." I rubbed my forehead. "If you mean I stopped work before required documentation was complete, yes. You blew up a relationship over paperwork. The issue was corrected. It would have been corrected without your theatrics. There were no theatrics. You threatened to stop the job. I did stop the job, and no one got hurt." I closed my eyes for a second. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about why Lydia was so comfortable calling the current problem a wording issue. "Dad, do you know why no one got hurt?" He laughed once. "Don't. Because we fixed the problem before the work continued. That is your version." "No. That's the timeline." "You're impossible. Then don't use me." He went quiet. I continued before he could redirect the conversation. If Lydia wants my professional opinion, she gets my professional opinion. She doesn't get to ask me for a safety review and then turn it into a family loyalty test because she doesn't like the answer. She's getting married in less than a month. I almost smiled. There it was. Somehow the wedding had already entered a conversation about an engineering hold. What does that have to do with the project? It means maybe you don't need to create stress right now. I'm not creating the condition in the engineer's note. You know exactly what you're doing. Actually, I do. He hung up on me. I did not call him back. That evening, I reopened the files Lydia had sent and made myself review them from the beginning. I had a rule about family disputes. If anger entered the room, I checked my work again. Not because my parents deserved the benefit of the doubt, because I did. If I was going to hold a line, I wanted to know the line was real. I compared dates. The engineering note was the latest technical document among the files Lydia had sent me. The summary had been created after that note. That meant the author of the summary had at least had the opportunity to see the hold condition. Opportunity was not intent. I wrote that down for myself. I checked the schedule extract next. The affected work sat in a sequence planned to begin Tuesday, May 26, the day after Memorial Day. There were preparation activities before it, but the sequence did not show a release milestone between the current date and the planned start. That did not prove anyone intended to violate a hold. It did tell me the issue was no longer theoretical. I emailed Lydia. One additional question. The schedule extract shows the affected work entering the Tuesday sequence after Memorial Day. Has the engineering hold been formally released? Or is the schedule pending that release? Her response came 20 minutes later. The team knows the condition. The schedule is a working document. I read it twice. Then I replied, that doesn't answer whether the hold has been released. She did not respond. The next morning, she texted me instead. You're making this much bigger than it needs to be. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. The first was too angry. The second was too sarcastic. The third was technically correct, but sounded like something I'd enjoy reading back later just because it proved I had been right. That was another flaw I knew about myself. I could become so focused on precision that I forgot precision was supposed to serve a decision, not my pride. So I put the phone down. An hour later, Lydia called. I almost ignored it, then answered. Has the hold been released? Good morning to you too. Has it? She laughed. You really cannot help yourself. Lydia, the team is coordinating with engineering. That's not a release. They're working through it. Then it hasn't been released. You don't know that. Then tell me I'm wrong. You don't understand how much pressure is on this project. You're right. I don't. That's why I'm not telling you how to run your entire project. I'm asking about one condition. If Mercer hears hold, they'll freeze everything. That's their decision. No, it isn't. It's our job to manage the information so they can make decisions without panicking. I went very still. Manage the information? You know what I mean. I want to be sure I do. Don't start. Does the owner know the engineer put a hold condition on that work? They have the engineering package. Does the summary they're using to track the job show it? You've seen the summary. That was the moment my concern changed. Not into certainty. Not into an accusation. Into responsibility. Because Lydia was no longer arguing that the warning didn't matter. She was arguing that the owner didn't need to see it clearly. I said, if the hold isn't formally released before that sequence moves forward, I'm going to notify the owner representative. Silence. Then, very quietly, you wouldn't. Yes, I would. Do you understand what that could do to my company? Do you understand what you're asking me to ignore? I'm not asking you to ignore anything. Then get the release confirmed. I told you the team is handling it. And I told you what happens if it isn't confirmed. Her voice sharpened. You always do this. You take one issue and turn it into a crusade. No. I'm telling you exactly where my involvement ends. You asked me to look. I looked. I raised the concern with you first. If you show me the hold was released, I'm done. And if I don't, if the schedule still moves toward that work without confirmation, I notify the owner. You're unbelievable. Maybe. But I'm being clear. She hung up. This time I did not feel the urge to call back, defend myself, or soften what I had said. I opened my email and wrote a final recap. Lydia, confirming our conversation this morning. I understand the affected work is still scheduled in the Tuesday sequence following Memorial Day. I have not received confirmation that the engineering hold has been formally released. If that confirmation is not provided before mobilization continues toward the affected work, I will notify the owner representative so they can independently verify status. I am not making any allegation about intent. My concern is limited to the discrepancy between the engineering note, the owner's summary, and the current schedule. I sent it. For the rest of that day, Lydia said nothing. Thursday passed. Then Friday morning came. I checked my inbox before my first client call. No release. No revised summary. No response from Lydia correcting a single line of my recap. I opened the schedule again. Tuesday was still there. Then I opened Mercer Hospitality's project contact information and found the name of the person representing the owner. Thomas Mercer, the man who would become my sister's father-in-law 3 weeks later. I stared at Thomas Mercer's name on the screen for several seconds before I touched the phone. Calling him was not the part that worried me. I had made uncomfortable calls for a living. I had stopped meetings, challenged schedules, and told people with far more money than patience that a signature did not erase a requirement. What bothered me was that Thomas was not just the owner representative on the project. In 3 weeks, he would be sitting in the front row while his son married my sister. No matter how carefully I handled the conversation, Lydia could later say I had used her wedding to get access to her client. That was exactly why I had waited until every cleaner option was gone. I pulled Lydia's email back onto my screen. I had her original request for a second opinion. I had the engineering note. I had the owner's summary. I had the schedule showing the affected work moving into the Tuesday sequence after Memorial Day. I had my written warning to Lydia and my follow-up recap stating that I would contact the owner if the hold was not confirmed. What I did not have was confirmation that anyone intended to violate the engineering condition. That distinction mattered to me. I was not calling Thomas to tell him my sister was dishonest. I was calling to tell him that 2 documents did not say the same thing, and that the schedule appeared to be moving faster than the condition protecting that work. I dialed. His assistant answered first. I introduced myself by name and company, then explained that I needed to speak with Mr. Mercer about a time-sensitive risk issue involving one of his active renovation projects. I did not mention Lydia until she asked which project. The Franklin House redevelopment. There was a short pause while she checked something. Are you with Reed Project Group? No. My firm is independent. Are you under contract on the job? No. That answer probably made me sound less important, not more. I received a limited set of project documents from Reed Project Group for an outside compliance review. I believe Mr. Mercer should independently verify a hold condition before scheduled work proceeds. Another pause. Can you email that? I can, but I would like to speak with him before I send the documents so he knows exactly what I am and am not alleging. That seemed to get her attention. She put me on hold. Thomas picked up less than 2 minutes later. This is Thomas Mercer. His voice was lower than I remembered from the engagement dinner. We had spoken there for maybe 5 minutes about nothing more consequential than parking downtown and whether Grant had inherited his father's hatred of golf. Thomas knew I was Lydia's sister because we had been introduced that night, but I did not assume he remembered me clearly. Mr. Mercer, this is Allison Reed. I remember you. I'm Lydia's sister. I remember that too. That made what I had to say both easier and harder. I need to tell you something before I explain why I'm calling. Lydia and I have a difficult relationship. We also have a history of disagreeing professionally. I don't want you treating anything I say as more credible because I'm family, and I don't want you treating it as less credible because of the history either. He was quiet for a second. That's an unusual opening. It's relevant. All right. I was asked by Lydia to give a limited second opinion on several documents from the Franklin House project. Her contract allows outside technical and compliance consultation on the extracts she sent me. I'm not on your project team, and I don't have access to your project platform. What did she ask you to review? Whether an engineering note was being treated too conservatively? His voice changed slightly. And was it? I can't answer that from the documents I received. What I can tell you is that the engineering note contains a hold condition before a specific work sequence proceeds. The owner-facing summary Lydia sent me does not include that condition, and the schedule extract still shows the affected work moving into the Tuesday sequence after Memorial Day. Thomas did not interrupt. I continued. I asked Lydia whether the hold had been formally released. She has not provided confirmation. I told her in writing that if it wasn't confirmed and the schedule continued toward the affected work, I would notify the owner representative. You told her you were going to call me? I told her I would notify the owner. I found your name on the project contact information this morning. Why didn't you call Grant? The question was fair, because Grant doesn't run the project. Another short silence. He is marrying your sister. Yes. And you're calling his father 3 weeks before the wedding. I'm aware of the timing. Does Grant know you're doing this? No. Why not? Because this isn't a relationship problem. Your company owns the project. You have the authority to verify whether that work should proceed. Grant doesn't. Thomas exhaled softly. I could not tell whether he was impressed, irritated, or simply thinking, so I did not try to decide for him. What exactly are you asking me to do? Verify the documents yourself before the affected work starts. Are you asking me to suspend the project? No. I'm not in a position to tell you how to run your project. I'm asking you to verify whether the engineering hold has been released, and whether your owner-facing information accurately reflects the current condition. Are you alleging Lydia removed the language? No. Are you alleging somebody intentionally concealed it? No. Then what are you alleging? Nothing yet. That answer seemed to surprise him. I looked at the documents on my screen. I have a discrepancy. I have an unanswered question. And I have a schedule. That's enough for me to tell you the issue exists. It's not enough for me to tell you why. Thomas was quiet long enough that I checked the call screen to make sure we were still connected. Then he said, "Send me what you have." I will. Everything Lydia sent you. I'll send the documents relevant to this issue, and the email chain showing how I received them. I don't think you need unrelated correspondence between us. Fair. I also want to be clear about one thing. Go ahead. If I'm wrong, I want you to know that too. I don't want this becoming a family story where everyone decides who they believe before anyone checks the records. I wasn't planning to decide anything based on family. Good. He almost laughed. You don't leave much room for people to agree with you gracefully, do you? There were about 6 answers I could have given. Most of them would have proved his point. I've been told that before. I imagine you have. I'll send the packet within 15 minutes. I'll look at it. Thank you. Before he could hang up, I added, one more request. What is it? Please don't involve Grant unless your review gives you a reason to. And please don't let this touch the wedding unless it has to. That time, the silence lasted longer. You're asking me not to tell my son you're raising a concern about the company his future wife runs. I'm asking you to verify a professional issue before you turn it into a personal one. And if I decide he needs to know, then that's your decision. I just don't want the wedding used as leverage in either direction. Thomas said, "Send the documents." The call ended. I sat there for another minute with the phone still in my hand. Then I built the packet. I did not send screenshots arranged to make Lydia look guilty. I did not write a cover memo about our childhood. I did not tell Thomas what Dad had said about me, or how often Lydia had called me paranoid. None of that belonged in the review. I sent 4 things. The original engineering note Lydia had provided, the owner-facing summary, the schedule extract, and the email chain showing when Lydia had asked for my opinion, what I had told her, and when I had warned that I would escalate if the hold remained unconfirmed. My cover email was shorter than the packet. Thomas, attached are the documents discussed. My concern is limited to the discrepancy between the engineering hold condition, the owner-facing summary, and the scheduled work sequence. I have no access to Mercer Hospitality's project system and cannot verify what other documents may exist there. Please independently confirm status with your project team. I am not making an allegation regarding intent. I sent it at 11:23 Saturday morning. Then I went back to work. That sounds calmer than it felt. For the rest of the day, I kept expecting Lydia to call. She didn't. I wondered whether Thomas had contacted her immediately, whether he had decided I was overreacting, or whether he had handed the packet to someone on his team without attaching my name to it. I did not know, and I made myself live with that. That was harder for me than I like to admit. I was good at uncertainty when it belonged to numbers. I could hold 3 technical explanations in my head at once and wait for evidence. I was much worse when uncertainty involved people I already distrusted. With Lydia, I had to keep reminding myself not to make intent out of pattern just because the pattern was familiar. Sunday afternoon, an email from Thomas appeared. The subject line was simple: Franklin House. I opened it immediately. Allison, I've instructed the project director to hold the affected work package pending revalidation of the engineering condition. The planned Tuesday sequence will not proceed into the affected area unless the hold is formally released. I am keeping the source of the concern confidential while we verify the documents. I will contact you if I need clarification regarding the materials you sent. I read it twice. The first feeling I had was relief, not satisfaction. Relief. The work was held. That was what I had wanted. There would be no crew walking into a sequence that might or might not have been properly released while people argued about wording. Thomas could investigate the rest on his own timeline because the immediate risk was no longer moving toward Tuesday. I replied with one sentence thanking him for confirming the hold. Then I closed the email. For almost 2 days, nothing happened. On Tuesday morning, Lydia called me while I was driving to a client meeting. I answered through the car system. Hey, did you hear Mercer delayed the sequence? I kept my eyes on the road. No, technically that was not true. Thomas had told me he placed the affected package on hold. I knew the result before Lydia called. What I did not know was what Mercer had told her, or what reason they had given. I corrected myself before the lie could settle. Actually, I know the affected package was put on hold. There was silence through the speakers. How? I raised the concern with the owner after you didn't confirm the release. You called Thomas? Yes. She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and disbelief. You actually called my future father-in-law. I called the owner representative. He's my fiancé's father. He's also the person responsible for the owner's side of that project. You promised me you weren't going to make this personal. I didn't. You called him about a project he owns. You could have ruined everything. What exactly is everything? My relationship with his family. The contract. The wedding. Do you understand how this looks? Do you understand that the work is now held until the condition is verified? It didn't need to be. Then engineering can release it and the hold ends. You're unbelievable. You've said that. This is exactly what Dad warned me about. I almost asked what version of me Dad had given her this time, but I stopped myself. What did Mercer tell your team? That the owner wants the package revalidated. Then revalidate it. You're enjoying this. No. You sound pretty calm. What would you prefer? I'd prefer you act like my sister for once. I tightened my hands around the wheel. You sent me project documents because you wanted my professional opinion. I wanted 10 minutes of help. You got it. I didn't ask you to interfere. I told you in writing what I would do if the hold wasn't confirmed. You use paperwork to make everything sound reasonable. Paperwork doesn't change what I said. She went quiet. Then she said, Mercer doesn't need people panicking over one engineer covering himself. Then you should be able to show them that. You really think you're the only person in the room who understands risk? No. That's why I asked the owner to verify it themselves. She hung up. I drove the rest of the way to my meeting without calling her back. The old Allison might have. Not to apologize. To win. I would have wanted the last word, the cleaner explanation, the sentence that made it impossible for Lydia to keep pretending I had acted irrationally. Age had not made me less stubborn. It had only made me a little better at recognizing when stubbornness stopped serving a useful purpose. The work was held. Thomas was verifying. There was nothing else I needed from Lydia. At least, that was what I believed. The following week was strangely quiet. Mom texted me about wedding logistics as if nothing had happened. Final headcount is done. Rehearsal dinner starts at 6. Please be on time. I stared at the message. No. How are you? No mention of Dad's call. No mention of Lydia. Just logistics. I replied, I'll be there. A few hours later, she sent another message. We've moved a few seats around at the reception. Don't take it personally. I laughed out loud. There were phrases only my mother could write that sounded like a warning and a confession at the same time. What changed? You'll see when you get there. I almost pressed. Then I decided I did not care where I sat. I had already booked a room at a hotel near the venue. I would drive myself. I would attend the ceremony, stay through dinner, and leave when I wanted. I did not need my parents' approval, Lydia's gratitude, or Grant's family to understand whatever story had been told about me. That was my plan. A clean appearance. No confrontation. No project talk. No emotional ambush. For the next 2 weeks, I heard nothing from Thomas beyond one request to confirm that the attachments he had received were the same files Lydia had originally sent me. I confirmed the file names, dates, and email timestamp. He thanked me. That was all. I did not ask what his team had found. Partly because I believed the review belonged to Mercer Hospitality now. Partly because I did not want to know enough to tempt myself into doing something with it before the wedding. Then, 2 days before Lydia married Grant, another email arrived. This one was even shorter. Allison, brief status only. The affected work remains held. Our team has confirmed the 2 versions you provided are materially different regarding the hold language. We are still reviewing the decision chain and intent. No conclusion has been reached. I will not discuss the matter with you further unless necessary while that review is ongoing. I appreciated the last sentence more than he probably intended. Thomas was not recruiting me into his investigation. He was not sharing gossip. He had told me the one thing I had a legitimate reason to know. The discrepancy existed. The work was still held. Intent remained unresolved. I replied, "Understood. Thank you." Then I closed my laptop and packed for my sister's wedding. I considered not going. For about 5 minutes, I let myself imagine the relief of staying home. No seating chart designed by my mother. No relatives asking why Lydia and I were distant. No dad watching me across the room for evidence that I was about to ruin something. No chance of Lydia looking at me and deciding that my face alone counted as hostility. But if I stayed away, I knew exactly what would happen. Lydia would tell people I had refused to come because I couldn't stand seeing her happy. Dad would say I had always punished the family when I did not get my way. Mom would sigh and tell everyone she had tried so hard to keep the peace. My absence would become proof of whatever story they wanted. I was tired of lending them material. So I went. Not because I needed to prove I was a good sister. Not because I believed attendance would repair anything. I went because I had accepted the invitation months earlier, and I refused to let my own avoidance become useful to people who already treated interpretation as fact. I drove myself to the hotel Friday afternoon. I kept my suitcase small enough to carry in one hand. My room key stayed in my own wallet. My car stayed in the parking lot. Those details might sound trivial, but independence is sometimes built out of trivial things. I did not need Dad to drive me. I did not need Mom to tell me where I was sleeping. I did not need Lydia to arrange a ride if I wanted to leave. At the rehearsal dinner, Thomas greeted me near the bar. "Allison, Thomas." That was it. No project. No knowing look. No whispered update. He moved on to speak with another guest. I noticed Lydia watching us from across the room. Her expression stayed pleasant, but she watched for a second too long. I wondered whether Mercer had ever told her where the concern had originated. I did not ask. Grant found me later and thanked me for coming. He seemed genuinely relieved. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "So am I." That was mostly true. He smiled. Lydia gets stressed before big events. "So I've heard." He laughed. I did not. I had known Grant for 3 years, but not well. Most of our interactions happened at holidays or dinners where Lydia managed the room carefully. He was not stupid. He was not arrogant. He also had no reason to question the version of our family Lydia had given him. That would matter later. At the time, I only thought he looked tired and happy, which seemed normal for a man getting married the next morning. The ceremony on Saturday was beautiful. I can say that without bitterness. Lydia looked radiant. Grant cried when he saw her. Mom cried louder. Dad walked Lydia down the aisle with the solemn pride of a man escorting his only daughter toward the most important moment of her life. I was seated with extended family, not beside my parents, not close to the front, but present. After the ceremony, while people moved toward cocktails and photographs, Mom approached me. "We're keeping immediate family photos simple." I looked at her. "What does simple mean?" "Just your father, me, Lydia, and Grant for the formal set. I'm immediate family." Her mouth tightened. "Allison, don't what? Make this a thing." I almost smiled. "I'm not making anything. I'm asking what you meant. Lydia wants some pictures with just us." "Then take them." Mom blinked, clearly prepared for a fight I did not give her. "I don't care which photos I'm in." "Good. But if anyone later says I refused family pictures, I'm going to correct that." Her expression changed. There it was again. The problem was never simply that I objected. The problem was that I had started learning to preserve the difference between what happened and what they later said happened. Mom walked away. I stood near the edge of the terrace and watched the photographer arrange them. Dad, Mom, Lydia, Grant. A perfect square. I felt something, but it was not heartbreak. More like confirmation. By then, I thought I understood what kind of wedding day I had walked into. I was wrong. What I did not understand was that Thomas had spent the previous 3 weeks looking at a professional discrepancy while knowing almost nothing about the private machinery of our family. He knew I was Lydia's sister because I had told him. He knew our relationship was difficult because I had disclosed it. He knew the project documents were different. He did not know what my parents were willing to say when Lydia needed a version of reality protected. Neither did Grant. Neither did his family. That changed during the reception. But before Lydia ever stood with that microphone and told the room she had grown up an only child, Thomas had already done the one thing I needed him to do. He had stopped the work. He had checked the documents. And he had refused to decide who was lying before he knew what the records could actually prove. By the time dinner ended, I had stopped expecting anything from my family except predictability. Lydia had gotten her photographs without me. Mom had managed to make that sound like a practical choice instead of an exclusion. Dad had spent most of the evening circulating between tables with the expression of a man whose greatest achievement had finally been placed under flattering lighting. None of it surprised me anymore. What did surprise me was how normal the Mercer family remained around me. Grant's aunt asked about my work. One of his cousins remembered meeting me at the engagement dinner. Thomas nodded to me once from across the room and then returned to a conversation with 2 guests as if we had never exchanged anything more consequential than weather reports. That helped. I did not want a secret alliance with my sister's future father-in-law. I did not want him watching me for cues or treating me like the injured party in some private family war. I had sent him a professional concern. He had acted on it. That was where I wanted the connection to end. Unless the evidence required something more. The ballroom had softened by then. Dinner plates had been cleared. Champagne moved from table to table. The band had stepped back while the speeches began, and the room had settled into the gentle restlessness that comes after people have been sitting too long in formal clothes. Lydia and Grant were at the head table, framed by white flowers and candles. My parents sat close enough to look like part of the arrangement. I was farther away. Not dramatically far, just far enough that nobody could mistake where the center of the family had been placed. A few relatives came by my table between speeches. Aunt Susan squeezed my shoulder. A cousin I had not seen in 2 years asked whether I was still doing compliance work. Nobody mentioned the photographs. Nobody mentioned my mother's simple family set. That was another way families survived their own discomfort. If no one named the thing, perhaps it did not fully exist. Then Lydia stood for her speech, and the moment I had spent years being prepared for finally happened in the most public way possible. She thanked Grant's parents first, then the wedding party, then everyone who had traveled to celebrate with them. Her voice was warm and polished, and for a while there was nothing unusual in what she said. She talked about learning to be independent, about making her own traditions, about being stubborn enough to build a career before 30. People laughed in the right places. Grant watched her with the kind of expression that made me look away for a second because, whatever else was true about my sister, he loved the version of her he knew. Then Lydia moved into childhood. She said she had learned early how to entertain herself because there were no siblings running around the house, no built-in group of people her age, nobody else sharing the ordinary chaos of growing up. I felt something inside me tighten, but I still told myself she was exaggerating for the sake of a sentimental speech. She had done that before. She could turn emotional distance into physical absence whenever the cleaner story served her better. Then she said, "I grew up an only child." The reaction was not dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody dropped a glass. Real embarrassment is usually quieter than that. Aunt Susan turned toward me first. Then one of Mom's cousins did the same. Two relatives at the next table stopped smiling. They had watched Lydia and me grow up in the same house. They had seen us at Christmas dinners, graduations, family cookouts, and the years when I came back from college and later worked for Dad. They knew enough to understand that Lydia's sentence was not technically wrong because of some hidden family history. It was simply false. I looked at her across the room, and Lydia looked back. That was the detail that removed the last possible excuse. Her expression did not change. She did not stumble over the wording or look embarrassed that she had gone too far. She held my gaze for one deliberate beat, then turned back toward Grant. She knew I had heard her. She knew other people were looking at me. And she kept going. Dad made it worse. He pushed his chair back and stood with his champagne glass in his hand. And we couldn't have asked for a better daughter. That sentence landed harder than Lydia's. Lydia could claim emotion. She could say she had meant she felt alone or that I had stopped being a sister to her years ago. Dad had no such excuse. He understood exactly who was sitting 10 feet away. He had spent the first 18 years of my life calling me his daughter. He had paid my college application fees, signed birthday cards, yelled at me for coming home late, argued with me across conference tables, and spent the last 8 years complaining that I remembered too much. Yet there he was, reinforcing a version of our family that required everyone in the room to pretend I had somehow appeared from nowhere. Mom did not stand, but she lifted her glass. That was enough. I watched the hesitation move through the room as people tried to decide whether they were supposed to clap, laugh, or politely accept that some private rupture had rewritten biology. I still did not move. That was when Thomas Mercer reached inside his jacket and pulled out his phone. He did not sound angry. If anything, his calm made the interruption sharper. "That's strange," he said, looking toward Dad. "Your other daughter called me 3 weeks ago. And I saved what she sent me." The room changed instantly. Not because Thomas had exposed the project. He had not. He did not mention the engineering hold, the summary, or the schedule. He only said enough to establish one fact Lydia and my parents had just publicly denied. I existed, I was Lydia's sister, and Thomas already knew it from a conversation that had happened weeks before the wedding. Grant turned toward Lydia before he looked at me. That mattered. "What is he talking about?" Lydia gave a small laugh. "Not now." Thomas remained standing. Dad looked at me and said my name, with the kind of accusation that made it sound as though my existence had become misconduct again. "Allison." I set my glass down. I could feel the attention in the room, but I no longer felt embarrassed. They had already done the most humiliating thing they could do. They had denied me publicly and expected me to cooperate by staying invisible. Grant asked, "What did you send my father?" I kept my answer deliberately narrow. Project records Lydia asked me to review. His team confirmed there was a discrepancy. Anything beyond that belongs to Mercer's review. Lydia's face tightened immediately. Dad started saying this was her wedding. Mom asked everyone not to make a scene. Thomas cut through both of them by saying he was the one who had raised the issue in the room. Then he looked at Grant, Lydia, and me, and said we should take the conversation somewhere private. I followed because I had no interest in turning the reception into a public trial. What I did not understand then was why that ridiculous family lie mattered so much to Thomas. He had already confirmed there was a professional discrepancy. He had already put the affected work on hold. The wedding could not change what was written in the project records. At least, that was how I saw it. Much later, I learned that Thomas had been watching something else entirely. Until that room, he had treated my warning and Lydia's explanation as two competing accounts that might both contain some truth. He knew we had family history. He knew estranged siblings sometimes described childhood differently. He had no reason to assume Lydia's only child language meant anything more than bitterness or emotional distance. Then she said it in front of relatives who visibly knew otherwise. Dad confirmed it. Mom toasted it. Thomas told me later that was when he understood something important. The question was no longer whether Lydia and I disliked each other. The question was why so many people in my family were willing to help maintain a version of reality that could be disproved by simply looking across the room. He did not tell me that night. That night, he only said, "Grant, Allison, Lydia, let's step somewhere private." Lydia did not move. "This is ridiculous." Grant stood. Dad wouldn't say that in front of everyone for no reason. Something flickered across Lydia's face. Fear, maybe. Or anger. I did not try to name it. She set the microphone down. We walked into a small lounge just off the reception hall. The music and voices dropped to a muted hum when the door closed behind us. Grant spoke immediately. "Dad." Thomas put his phone away. The work Allison contacted me about was placed on hold the day after she called. Grant stared at him. "What work?" "The Franklin House project." He looked at Lydia. She crossed her arms. "It's a technical review." Thomas said, "It became a technical review after I received 2 versions of project information that did not communicate the same condition." Lydia turned to me. "You sent him everything?" "I sent what was relevant." "You had no right. You sent the documents to me for a second opinion, and you got one. I did not authorize you to distribute project material. Your contract allows outside review of the extracts you sent me." Her jaw tightened. Thomas cut in. "Allison did not send me anything I could not verify against project records. That was new information to me." I looked at him. "Did your team verify the documents were different?" "Yes." Lydia let out a breath. "Because they're supposed to be different." Grant looked at her. "What does that mean?" "One is an engineering note. The other is an owner summary. You don't copy technical documents word for word into executive updates." "Nobody said you do?" I replied. She looked at me. "Then stop acting like missing language proves something." "I haven't said it proves intent." "You called Thomas because of it." "I called Thomas because the engineering note had a hold condition and the summary did not, while the schedule still showed the work moving forward." Grant's eyes moved between us. "What kind of hold?" Thomas said, "A condition requiring confirmation before the affected work proceeded." Grant looked at Lydia again. "Was it released?" Lydia's shoulders stiffened. "The project team was coordinating with engineering." "Was it released?" "Not when Allison started inserting herself." That answer changed the room. Grant rubbed one hand over his face. "You knew it wasn't released?" "I knew it was being handled." "That's not what he asked," I said. Lydia turned on me. "Stop." "No." Her eyes widened. I rarely raised my voice with her. I did not raise it then either. But I had spent enough of the night allowing everyone else to decide what I was permitted to respond to. "You don't get to tell me to stop after saying you grew up an only child in front of me. This isn't about that." "It became about that when you decided to make me imaginary." Grant looked at her. "You told me Allison left the family years ago." "I did." "You never said she was involved in your work." "She isn't." "Then why did you send her project documents?" Lydia's face flushed. "For 10 minutes of advice." Grant stared at her. Thomas said nothing. Neither did I. Lydia looked around the room and seemed to realize that every direction was becoming another question. "So what?" I asked my sister for advice. "That doesn't mean she gets to call my client." Grant's head moved slightly. "You just called her your sister." Lydia froze. I wish I could say I enjoyed that. I didn't. It was too ugly. All she had to do was tell the truth in one room, and the lie in another had nowhere to stand. She recovered quickly. "You know what I meant." Grant's face changed. "No. Actually, I'm starting to think I don't." The door opened. Dad entered without knocking. Mom was behind him. Dad looked at me first. "Apologize." Grant turned. For what? Dad ignored him. For bringing business into Lydia's wedding. I stared at him. I did not bring it into the wedding. You called Thomas 3 weeks ago. You should never have involved him. Then who should I have called? Lydia. I did. Then you should have trusted her to handle it. I gave her that chance. You don't give people chances. You issue demands. Thomas finally spoke. William, Allison did not contact me asking that Lydia be punished. Dad looked at him. You don't know her. I know what she sent. Dad's jaw tightened. Thomas continued. She asked me to verify whether a hold condition had been released before affected work proceeded. That's what I did. Mom stepped forward. Can we please stop talking about this tonight? I looked at her. Do you even know what we're talking about? Her eyes shifted toward Lydia. I know enough. No. Do you know what was in the documents? That's not the point. There it was. I felt something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. For years I had tried to believe my mother cared about fairness but hated conflict. That distinction disappeared for me in that room. She did not need to know whether I had been right. She needed the consequences of me being right to disappear. The point, she said, is that this is your sister's wedding. I nodded. You're right. She seemed relieved. Then I picked up my bag from the chair where I had placed it when we entered. I'm leaving. Dad stared at me. Of course you are. I looked at him. You say that like staying would prove something. You always run when people call you out. No. I leave when the conversation stops being useful. Lydia laughed bitterly. You've ruined the entire night, and now you're walking away. I didn't make your speech. You made Dad say that. That almost stopped me. What? You sit there judging everyone, and then you act shocked when people finally say how they feel. Grant looked at her. Dad said, that's enough. But not because Lydia had gone too far, because Grant was listening. I could hear it in his tone. I looked at my sister. You think Dad stood up because of me? He stood up because he's tired of watching you make everything about yourself. I thought about the microphone, about the sentence, about the heads turning toward me. You told a room full of relatives you were an only child. Emotionally, I was. Grant closed his eyes for a second. That was worse than the original lie. Now it was not a mistake. It was a justification. I said. Then you should have said that. She folded her arms. I shouldn't have to explain my childhood to you. You don't. You just shouldn't rewrite mine. Dad stepped closer. Enough, Allison. I held up one hand. Don't touch me. He stopped. The reaction was small. But I saw it. For most of my 20s, I would have explained why I was leaving. I would have defended my tone. I would have tried to make Dad admit that he had treated us differently. I would have asked Mom why keeping peace always meant I had to absorb the damage. I would have demanded Lydia say the word sister. I did none of those things. I looked at Thomas. If you need clarification about the documents I sent, email me. He nodded. I will. I looked at Grant. I'm sorry this is happening tonight. He shook his head. You didn't make her say it. Lydia stared at him. I walked out before that sentence could become another fight. Back in the reception room, the band had started playing again. People were trying to recover. Some guests looked away when I passed. Others looked directly at me. Aunt Susan came toward me immediately. What happened? Nothing I want to discuss here. Do you want me to come with you? No. Stay. She frowned. Are you sure? I'm sure. I squeezed her hand. Enjoy the wedding. That made her laugh once, despite everything. You're impossible. So I've been told. I reached my table, collected my purse, and checked that I had my phone and hotel key. Mom's cousin leaned toward me. Allison, I heard what Lydia said. I looked at her. So did I. That was not right. No. Do you want me to say something? No. She looked surprised. I don't need a vote. I meant it. That was the strangest freedom of the night. For years I had wanted witnesses. Not because I wanted people to attack my family for me. Because I wanted confirmation that I had not imagined the pattern. Now I had a room full of witnesses, and it did not feel like victory. It felt unnecessary. I already knew what had happened. Outside, the June air was warm and heavy. I walked to my car alone. No one stopped me. No one needed to. My hands were steady when I unlocked the door. I sat there for a minute before starting the engine. Through the windows of the venue, I could still see movement inside. A wedding continuing after the bride's sister had walked out. That was fine. I had never wanted Lydia's wedding destroyed. I wanted the dangerous work held. I wanted the documents checked. I wanted my family to stop using my silence as permission. 2 of those things had already happened. The third had just started. I drove back to the hotel. When I reached my room, I took off my shoes, changed out of my dress, and put my phone face down on the desk. I knew there would be messages. I did not want them yet. For an hour, I showered, washed off makeup, and watched part of a late movie without understanding a single scene. Then I checked my phone. 7 missed calls. Dad twice. Mom 3 times. Lydia once. Grount once. There were texts, too. Mom, please call me. We need to fix this before people start talking. Dad, you embarrassed your sister in front of her new family. Unbelievable. Lydia, I hope you're happy. Grant's message was different. Can we talk tomorrow? I need to ask you something about what Lydia told me about your family. I read that one twice. Then I saw an email notification. Thomas. The subject line was Franklin House Review. I opened it. Allison, I won't discuss tonight further. One project update is relevant to the documents you provided. We located an earlier owner summary draft in the project platform. The hold language was still in it. I may need to clarify your source copies next week. I sat down. The final summary I had seen did not contain the hold. An earlier owner summary draft did. That changed the question. Until that moment, Lydia could still argue the engineering condition had simply never been carried into the summary. Now I knew it had been there once. Someone had removed it. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was replaying Lydia's speech. That part had already settled into something too clear to obsess over. She had said what she meant. Dad had backed her. Mom had toasted it. There was no puzzle left in that. The email from Thomas was different. An earlier owner summary draft had contained the hold language. The final version did not. That did not prove Lydia had removed it, and I forced myself to keep repeating that distinction every time my mind tried to move faster than the evidence. But it did eliminate one of the easiest explanations. The condition had not simply failed to make it into the summary. At some point, it had been there. My phone started ringing a little after 8 the next morning. Mum. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning. Allison, what did you send Thomas? No hello. No question about whether I had made it back to the hotel safely. No mention of the fact that one daughter had publicly denied the existence of the other the night before. I sat on the edge of the bed. Good morning to you too. Please don't do that. Do what? Make this harder. I looked toward the closed curtains. What exactly is this? You know what I mean. No, Mom. I know several things happened last night. I'd like to know which one you're calling the problem. She exhaled. Thomas has people looking into Lydia's project. He's had people looking into it for 3 weeks. Silence. That was the first indication Lydia had not told my parents the real timeline. Mom said, 3 weeks? Yes. Why? Because I contacted him 3 weeks ago. I know that now. Then why are you talking like this started at the reception? Because that's when you humiliated her. I almost laughed. You raised a glass after she said she grew up an only child. Allison, please. No. You called me this morning. If we're going to discuss humiliation, let's be accurate. She was speaking emotionally. So was Dad? Your father was proud of his daughter. Which one? She went quiet. I hated how satisfying that question felt. It was too easy. A clean line that cut exactly where I knew it would. Part of me still had that instinct. And I did not pretend otherwise. I could be cruel when I was certain I was right. The difference now was that I recognized the impulse before turning it into a habit. Mom said, "This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes a courtroom with you. I'm asking what you want. I want you to tell Thomas you misunderstood the project." I stared at the wall. Have you read the engineering note? No. Have you read the owner summary? No. Have you seen the schedule? No. Then how do you know I misunderstood anything? Her voice sharpened. Because Lydia knows her own project better than you do. Then she should be able to explain the discrepancy. She's trying to save her marriage right now. Her marriage is less than 24 hours old. Exactly. I let that sit. Mom continued. Grant is upset. Thomas is asking questions. People at the wedding are already talking. Your sister is devastated. Did she ask you to call me? Does it matter? Yes. Why? Because I want to know whether I'm speaking to my mother or Lydia's representative. That is a horrible thing to say. Then answer the question. Mom did not. That was an answer. I stood and walked to the small desk near the window. I am not calling Thomas to tell him I misunderstood something I have not been shown to misunderstand. You could tell him it was a family disagreement. It wasn't. You said yourself you and Lydia have history. I disclosed that to him before I sent anything. He verified the documents independently. You don't know what he's verified. I know enough to know the affected work is on hold, and the two versions are materially different. That stopped her. How do you know that? He told me. You've been talking to him? He sent status updates relevant to the information I provided. Mom lowered her voice. Allison, do you hear yourself? Yes. You sound like you're enjoying this. No. I sound like I'm refusing to lie. I didn't ask you to lie. You asked me to tell him I misunderstood, without knowing what I saw. Because sometimes family matters more than being right. There it was. Not whether I was right. Whether being right should matter. I looked down at the phone. I have a client call in 20 minutes. So that's it? For now. Your sister needs you. No. Lydia needs me to change the record. You're being dramatic. I haven't posted anything. I haven't called relatives. I haven't contacted Grant. I haven't asked Thomas to punish her. I am sitting in a hotel room answering your call. If this is drama, I'm not the one producing it. You're impossible. That's becoming a family slogan. I ended the call. Dad called 4 minutes later. I almost admired the coordination. I answered because I wanted to know what version he had been given. He did not disappoint me. You waited until her wedding. No. You sat on this for weeks and then let Thomas blow it up at the reception. I contacted him 3 weeks ago. You knew what he was going to do. I had no idea he was going to say anything. You expect me to believe that? I don't care. That came out colder than I intended. Dad went silent. I continued. Thomas had already placed the work on hold. He had already confirmed the documents were different. I asked him not to involve Grant or the wedding unless necessary. And yet there he was, pulling out his phone in front of everyone. That was his choice. You knew he'd take your side. He didn't take my side. He checked the records. Same thing with you. No, Dad, it isn't. He laughed bitterly. You've wanted Lydia knocked down for years. Then why did I warn her before I called anyone? Because you wanted to cover yourself. That answer told me how far he was willing to go. Every reasonable action I took could be recast as calculation. If I warned Lydia, I was building a defense. If I documented the warning, I was creating a trap. If I escalated after she did not resolve it, I was sabotaging her. There was no behavior available to me that would make him consider the possibility that I had acted because the concern was real. I said, "Do you know what Thomas found last night?" Dad hesitated. No. Neither do I. Beyond one thing. What? An earlier owner summary draft still had the hold language in it. The silence changed. Not shock. Recognition. Tiny. But there. I noticed. That doesn't mean anything, he said. I didn't say it did. Drafts change. Yes. So why are you saying it like some smoking gun? I'm not. I'm telling you why the review is continuing. You're always like this. You find one detail and build a whole case. I haven't built a case. You called the client. After telling Lydia I would. Your sister trusted you. I almost smiled. She trusted me enough to ask for my expertise. Apparently not enough to accept the answer. She made the mistake of thinking you could behave like family. And what does family behavior look like, Dad? saying she grew up an only child while I was sitting there. He went quiet again. Then he said, "Maybe she felt that way." I closed my eyes. "Goodbye, Dad. Don't you hang up on me. I'm ending a conversation that isn't going anywhere. You're running again." "No, I'm declining another round." I ended the call before he could answer. For the next hour, I turned my phone off and worked. That sounds almost absurd in hindsight. But I had clients who did not care that my sister had erased me at her wedding or that her father-in-law was reviewing a disputed project summary. Their own deadlines still existed. Their own risk registers still needed updates. Normal work was useful because it reminded me that my family was not the whole world. Around noon, I turned my phone back on. There was one email from Thomas. "Allison, we may need to confirm the source history of the files Lydia sent you. I can share one finding relevant to that question. Our platform contains an intermediate owner summary draft in which the engineering hold language remains present. The final owner summary does not. We have not reached a conclusion about who made the change or why. Please preserve the original email and attachments you received from Lydia without modification." That was careful language. I appreciated it. No accusation. No implication that Lydia had done it. Just sequence. I replied that I had retained the original email and attachments in my normal business records and would preserve them unchanged. Then I stopped. I wanted to ask one question. Who created the intermediate draft? I did not. Thomas had told me what I needed to know. Anything more belonged to his review. 2 days later, he called. "I'm going to send you a limited written finding," he said. "It relates directly to the files you provided and to an explanation Lydia's company has given us. I don't want you assuming you're entitled to the full investigation. I'm not. I know. I'm saying it anyway. Fair. The intermediate summary was stored on our project platform before Lydia sent you your copies. The hold language was present in that version. Understood. The final owner summary was created afterward. The hold language was no longer there. Understood. We have not attributed the edit. Okay. Lydia's response is that the earlier version was an internal working draft, and that the final summary was intentionally condensed. That's possible." Thomas paused. "You sound less certain than most people would. I'm certain the documents differ. I'm not certain why. That may become important." I looked at the clock on my desk. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now. I wanted you to understand why we're preserving your source copies." "All right. And Allison?" "Yes?" "The wedding speech is not part of my technical finding." "I know. I'm telling you because I don't want family behavior mixed into a project conclusion." "I agree." "Good. That call did more to earn my trust than if he had told me he believed me completely. He was separating evidence from impression. The wedding had changed how he viewed the credibility issue, but he was not using it to decide who altered a file. That distinction mattered. The review moved quietly for several more days. My parents did not. Mom sent 3 texts asking whether I had fixed things with Thomas. I ignored the wording and replied once. "Thomas is conducting his own review. I am not directing it." Dad sent nothing. Lydia sent one message. "You could still stop this." I stared at it for a long time before responding. "I am not running the review," she replied immediately. "Don't pretend you don't know what you're doing." I put the phone down. There was no useful answer. The next material change came in a review memo Thomas sent, because part of it directly addressed the chain of documents I had provided. One line caught my attention before anything else. An old site email read, "Proceeding per Lydia's direction." I read the surrounding paragraph twice. The email came from the site superintendent, a man named Mark Ellison. I had never met him. According to the memo, Mark had been coordinating the Tuesday work sequence with Lydia's team. His email was one of the reasons Mercer was reviewing how the hold had been understood in the field. For the first time since this started, I felt my certainty shift in an uncomfortable direction. Maybe Lydia had not been the one pushing the work. Maybe Mark had taken a general direction and interpreted it too aggressively. That would not explain the missing hold language, but it could explain why the schedule remained active. People make mistakes in translation all the time. A project manager says, "Keep the schedule moving." a superintendent hears. Proceed unless someone stops you. The difference between those two sentences is where risk often hides. The memo said Lydia's written response suggested exactly that. Mark, she said, may have jumped the gun. That phrase bothered me. Not because it was impossible, because it was convenient. Still, convenience was not evidence. I called Thomas. I received the memo. Any issue with the source references? No, I have a question about Mark Ellison. Go ahead. Was proceeding per Lydia's direction referring to the affected work itself or the broader prep sequence? We're still clarifying that. Then I don't want to draw anything from it yet. Good. Has Mark been interviewed? Yes. I waited. Thomas did not elaborate. I respected that. Anything you need from me? Not yet. I hung up. For the rest of the afternoon, I thought about Mark. It would have been easy to decide he was the missing piece. A field superintendent pushing ahead. A project management firm assuming he understood the hold. An owner's summary that had been simplified for executives. No villain required. Just bad communication. Part of me wanted that explanation. Not for Lydia. For me? If the whole thing turned out to be ordinary project dysfunction, then I could step away knowing the work had been held and the process had corrected itself. I did not need Lydia to be guilty. I needed the risk addressed. That distinction became harder to maintain the deeper the family conflict went, which was why I kept reminding myself of it. 2 days later, Thomas sent another limited memo. Mark Ellison had been cleared of the concern that he intended to start the affected portion without release. I read slowly. Mark had kept a printed copy of the original engineering note in his field folder because, according to his statement, he did not believe the owner's summary clearly reflected the restriction. When the Tuesday sequence approached, he had allowed preparation outside the held area, but had not allowed the crew into the affected portion. He had never received formal release of the engineering hold. The phrase proceeding per Lydia's direction had referred to preparatory work outside the restricted scope. I leaned back. Mark had not been the person ignoring the warning. He had been the person refusing to cross it. The memo included an email he had sent immediately after a phone call with Lydia, confirming today's discussion. We can continue exterior prep and staging, but I still need written release before crew enters the held area. Please advise if your direction differs. There was no written reply from Lydia answering the release question. Instead, a later scheduling message from her office said only, "Keep Tuesday moving." I read that one several times. It still did not prove Lydia ordered anyone to violate the hold, but it made the pattern harder to dismiss. Every time someone asked the direct question, the answer became broader. Has the hold been released? The team is coordinating. Can the held work proceed? Keep the schedule moving. Does the owner's summary need the restriction? The technical package already contains it. Each answer lived near the question without touching it. Thomas called me later that afternoon. We cleared Ellison on the hold issue. I saw. He kept the crew outside the affected scope. Yes. He also says Lydia called him before Tuesday and told him she needed the schedule to keep moving. There's no recording? No. Then it's his statement. Correct. But he followed up by email. Correct. And she didn't answer whether the hold was released. Not in the records we've found. I exhaled. What does Lydia say? That Mark understood he was only authorized to continue prep, which seems to be what he did. Yes. So that isn't the issue. No. I appreciated that too. Thomas was not stretching a statement into misconduct just because Lydia had become harder to trust. What is the issue now? The decision trail on the owner's summary. I looked at the documents open on my screen, because the hold language was there in the intermediate draft, and gone in the final. Do you know who changed it? Not yet. Then we're still where we were. Not quite. I waited. We've requested a formal explanation from Reed Project Group regarding the version history. What does that have to do with me? Maybe nothing. That answer bothered me. Thomas. Lydia's written response raises a question about the copies you sent. I went still. What question? She says you have a history of retaining old company records and reconstructing timelines after disagreements. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. From my father's company? That's part of what she referenced. I left that company 8 years ago. I know. None of those records would create versions inside your project platform. I know that too. Then what exactly is she suggesting? She's not making a formal accusation yet. Yet. I heard the word even though Thomas had not said it. What did she say? That before Mercer assumes the documents you provided represent the actual project history, we should ask what you did with the copies she sent you. I looked at the email Lydia had sent me 4 weeks earlier. Her email, her attachments, her request. I could feel anger arriving, but beneath it was something colder. Recognition. This was familiar. The problem was no longer the missing language. The problem was becoming the person who noticed it. I said, "Do you need anything from me right now? Preserve everything exactly as it is." Already done. We may ask you for a formal source statement. I'll provide facts. That's all I want. When the call ended, I sat at my desk without moving. Then my phone lit up with a message from Dad. Lydia says Thomas thinks you manipulated her files. Are you happy now? I read it once. Then again. Thomas had said nothing of the kind. But the story had already changed before the evidence had. And for the first time since I called him, I understood that Lydia was no longer trying only to explain the documents. She was preparing to explain me. The first time Thomas told me Lydia had started talking about my history with records, I knew exactly what she was doing. She was not defending the summary anymore. She was changing the subject. That difference mattered because until then, every explanation Lydia had offered still lived somewhere near the documents. The intermediate draft had contained the hold language. The final summary had not. Her position was that the earlier version had been an internal working draft, that the final owner update had been intentionally condensed, and that nobody had ever been instructed to violate the engineering hold. I did not agree that those facts made the omission harmless, but at least they were arguments about the project itself. Then the questions became about me. Thomas sent me a limited copy of Lydia's formal written response because several sections directly addressed the files I had provided. He was careful about what he shared. I did not receive personnel interviews, internal legal advice, or anything unrelated to the source trail. What I saw was enough. Lydia wrote that owner summaries routinely simplified technical language. She said the final document was not intended to replace the engineer's note. She said field personnel had access to the full technical package and understood that no restricted work should proceed without release. She also said the schedule was a planning tool rather than an authorization to begin work. All of those statements were possible. Some were even true. The owner summary was not the engineering record. The schedule did not itself authorize a crew to ignore a hold. And Mark Ellison had ultimately kept his people outside the affected area. That was why I could not simply point to the missing sentence and say Lydia had knowingly endangered anyone. Then I reached the next paragraph. Mess. Reed's interpretation should also be considered in the context of her prior disagreements with Reed family businesses and her long-standing practice of retaining old project materials, reconstructing timelines, and assigning intentional misconduct to routine project decisions. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I did not understand it, because I wanted to be certain I was not adding hostility that was not there. I wasn't. The paragraph did not accuse me of altering anything. Not yet. It did something more useful to Lydia. It prepared the reader to distrust whatever came from me. I called Thomas. I received the response. I assumed you would have questions. 1. Go ahead. What does reconstructing timelines mean? Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's Lydia's characterization. I'm aware. Did she provide an example? She referenced your departure from your father's company and a prior dispute involving retained records. I stared at the sentence on my screen. Retained records? That is the phrase she used. I had authorized copies of project files from work I personally handled. I retained what I was required to retain for my own professional records when I left. I'm not making a judgment about that. I know, Thomas continued. She also says your habit of comparing old versions sometimes leads you to infer motives that aren't there. Did she identify where I inferred motive in what I sent you? No, because I specifically said I wasn't alleging intent. I know. I leaned back. Then why is this in her response? You'd have to ask her. I'm asking you why it's relevant to your review. It may not be. That answer settled me. Not completely, but enough. Thomas said, my team is still focused on the project records. I sent you her statement because it directly concerns the reliability of your source material and your handling of it. You had a right to know that was being raised. Has she disputed that she sent me the files? No. Has she disputed the dates? Not at this point. Has she disputed that I warned her before contacting you? No. Then I'll wait. Thomas let out a small breath. I thought you might. That isn't a compliment, is it? I haven't decided. I almost smiled. Fair enough. After the call, I closed Lydia's response and opened the original email she had sent me. Quick favor. 10 minutes. Tell me if I'm reading this engineer too conservatively. That was the thing about stories people build after a conflict begins. They rarely erase the first version completely. They just count on everyone forgetting it existed. Lydia had not sent those files to an enemy. She had sent them to someone whose judgment she trusted enough to ask for. The problem was that I had given her the wrong answer. My father called that evening. He did not mention Thomas by name at first. You're making this worse. I had just finished dinner. I carried my plate to the sink with the phone against my ear. Which part? You know which part. I've learned not to assume with this family. Lydia says they're treating her like she falsified something. Are they? Don't play games. I'm asking. They want to know who changed some draft. That seems reasonable. Dad made an angry sound. You act like you've never seen a document get revised. I've seen thousands. Then why are you acting like this is suspicious? I haven't said who changed it or why. You don't have to. You plant the suggestion and sit back while everyone else does the damage. I rinsed my plate slowly. Did Lydia show you what I sent Thomas? She told me enough. That's not what I asked. You always do that. What? Turn conversations into depositions. You called me to accuse me of something. I'm asking what you based it on. I don't need your files to know you keep records on people. That made me stop. Records on people? You know what I mean. No, explain it. You've always kept copies of everything. Emails, drafts, notes. Every disagreement becomes a file. That's my job. It wasn't your job to keep Dad's company records after you left. I set the plate down. There it was. The 8-year-old story, upgraded for present use. I kept copies of documents I was entitled and required to retain from projects I worked on. I did not walk out with your server. You kept enough. Enough for what? Enough to throw things back in people's faces years later. When have I done that? You brought up the old hold issue just last week. You brought it up. Dad went quiet. I could hear the television in the background at his house. He finally said, Lydia thinks you're doing the same thing now. The same thing as what? Building a case. Against whom? Here. I leaned against the counter. Dad, I didn't create the engineering note. I didn't create the owner summary. I didn't create the schedule. Lydia sent those files to me herself. That doesn't mean your interpretation is honest. There are sentences that make you angry. Then there are sentences that clarify a relationship. That one did both. I said, if you believe I'm dishonest, you should probably stop calling me for explanations. Don't twist my words. I'm not. You think you're smarter than everyone. No. I think documents exist outside our opinions. And there it is. What? That tone. That's why Lydia has never felt like she had a sister. I laughed once before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny, because the timing was almost elegant. So now we're back to the wedding. I'm telling you why she said what she said. She said she grew up an only child. Emotionally. She lived in the same house with me for 18 years. You left for college when she was 10, and came home every break. Then I came back after graduation and worked with both of you. She didn't experience you as a sister. Then she should say she doesn't like me. That's allowed. You always need the exact wording. Yes. Especially when the wording changes reality. Desihil. You're proving my point. I almost answered. Instead, I looked around my kitchen and asked myself what I was trying to accomplish. Nothing useful. I said, "Good night, Dad." "Allison." I ended the call. A few days later, Grant called me. His name on my screen surprised me more than Thomas's had. We had exchanged a handful of texts over the years, mostly birthdays and logistics. Grant had never called me alone. I answered, "Hey, is this a bad time?" "No." He hesitated. "I want to ask you something. And I'm not calling because of the project." "Okay. It's about what Lydia said at the wedding." I sat down. "Go ahead." I asked her why she didn't just tell me you were estranged. I waited. Grant continued. "She said that's not how she sees it. She said you left early and never really acted like a sister after that." "I see." "She said when she told me she basically grew up as an only child, she meant emotionally. That's what Dad told me too." Grant was quiet. Then he said, "Did you live together?" "Until I was 18. She was 10 when you left for college?" "Yes." "Were you gone after that?" "No. I came home during breaks. After college, I moved back to Columbus and worked in Dad's company." "For how long?" "Several years." Another pause. "I don't understand." I could have filled that silence with every family grievance I had collected since childhood. I did not. "What exactly are you trying to understand?" "Why she made it sound like you were almost never there." "That's something you'll have to ask her." I did. "And?" "She said being in the same house doesn't make people family." That one hurt. Less than it would have 10 years earlier. More than I wanted it to, Grant said. "She also said your parents were trying to protect her at the wedding because she thought you might make the night about yourself." I looked down at my hand. "Did she tell you what I did before her speech?" "No. Nothing." "Meaning?" I attended. I sat where I was assigned. I didn't speak about the project. I didn't confront her. I didn't object when Mom said she wanted immediate family photos without me. Grant went silent again. "She left you out of family photos?" "Some of them. She told me you refused." I closed my eyes. There it was. One small story. One small silence. I remembered standing on the terrace while Mom told me they wanted the formal family set simple. I had chosen not to fight because I truly did not care about a photograph. But afterward, Lydia had told Grant I refused. That was how it happened. Not one giant lie. 100 empty spaces. "I didn't refuse," I said. "Your photographer may remember. Mom told me they wanted those pictures without me." I said fine. Grant sounded tired. "I don't want you sending me proof." "I'm not going to. I mean it. I'm not calling to build some file against my wife." "I know. I just wanted one answer." "You have it." He exhaled. "I keep finding little things where what she told me is technically possible until I ask one more question." I understood exactly what he meant. "Then keep asking one more question." He was quiet for several seconds. "Are you trying to get me to leave her?" "No." "Do you want me to?" "No." That answer came easily. I did not want responsibility for Grant's marriage. I had enough history with people deciding my motives for me. He said, "You really don't?" "Grant, I barely know what your marriage looks like from inside it. Lydia is my sister. You're her husband. Whatever you decide about each other should be based on what you know, not what I want. I wish she talked about you that way." I did not know what to say to that, so I said the truth. "She hasn't for a long time." After we hung up, I thought about the photographs. Not just the wedding photographs. Older ones. Years earlier, Mom had posted a family picture from Lydia's business launch. I had not attended because I was working out of state. The caption said, "Our whole family celebrating Lydia's big day." I saw it and kept scrolling. Another time, Dad had told a client that Lydia was the one who inherited the business instinct. I had been sitting at the table. I said nothing. At a Christmas dinner, one of my uncles mentioned the old project dispute that supposedly caused me to leave Dad's company. Dad said, "Allison couldn't handle how fast construction moves." I corrected him once. He waved it off. I did not correct him again. For years I had told myself silence was dignity. I knew who I was. I did not need to defend myself at every dinner table. That belief had protected me from endless arguments. It had also given my family something useful. Empty space. Lydia filled it. Dad filled it. Mom softened whatever was left. By the time Grant met them, he had been introduced to a version of me that had been edited for years. I could not blame myself for their lies, but I could admit my pride had made those lies easier to maintain. I had treated explanation as beneath me. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was simply necessary. That realization did not make me want to call every relative and issue corrections. It made me understand why I had been right to put the project concern in writing. There are facts you can afford to let people misunderstand. There are facts you cannot. The next update from Thomas arrived the following Monday. We have completed a preliminary access review. Mercer Hospitality administers the project platform. Your name, company, and email address do not appear in any credential, guest access, upload, or edit record associated with the Franklin House workspace. The files you received were exports transmitted to you by Lydia Reed. I read that sentence slowly. There was more. The intermediate and final summary versions were created within the Mercer-administered platform before the timestamp of Lydia's email transmitting the exported documents to you. That was important, not because it proved who had changed the summary, because it fixed the order of events. The project versions existed before I received my copies. I could not have created those internal versions afterward. Thomas called 10 minutes later. I wanted you to have that in writing. Thank you. There's more. I waited. Lydia's response is that you don't need platform access to create a misleading comparison. I frowned. What does that mean? Her position is that you may have selected old exports, compared them out of sequence, and presented them in a way that makes normal revision look suspicious. She sent me the files in the same email. I know. With the file names. I know. And the intermediate version you're reviewing is in your own platform. Correct. Then what exactly am I supposed to have constructed? That's what we're asking her to explain. I stood and walked toward the window. Is she formally accusing me of manipulating documents? Not yet. I hated the phrase. Not yet, Thomas continued. She is challenging the inference drawn from the materials and your reliability in presenting them. I didn't draw an inference about intent. That's reflected in your emails. So, why are we discussing my reliability? Because the direction of her response has changed. I looked down at the street. From the documents to me, yes. At least he said it. I felt anger rise cleanly this time. Not the hot anger I had felt when Lydia called me unbelievable. This was different. Professional. Someone was beginning to suggest that I had manipulated the presentation of project records. That was not family gossip. That could touch my work, my clients, my insurance, my name. I said, if this becomes a formal allegation, I need to know immediately. You will. I also want a copy of anything that specifically alleges I altered, fabricated, misrepresented, or improperly retained project information. Within what we're permitted to provide, yes. Good. Thomas hesitated. Allison, don't contact Lydia about this. I almost laughed. I wasn't planning to. Good. I learned a long time ago that when someone wants to turn facts into a personality argument, the worst thing you can give them is an emotional phone call. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then, that's probably wise. That afternoon, an email arrived from Dad. Not a call. An email. The subject line said, Statement regarding Allison Reed. I knew before opening it that he had been asked to put something in writing. The message was addressed to a Mercer Review contact and copied to Lydia. I had been forwarded the relevant portion because it disgusted me. Dad wrote that during my time at Reed Renovation, I had a long-standing habit of retaining company records after disagreements and later relying on those records to challenge management decisions. He said my personal interpretation of project history should therefore be treated with caution. I stared at the screen. 8 years earlier, he had hated that I kept records. Now he was trying to use that habit as proof that records involving me were suspect. I read the statement again. He did not say I stole anything. He did not say I falsified anything. He did not say I had ever altered a document. That was what made it useful. It sounded reasonable, measured. Parental concern translated into professional language. I called him. It was the only call I made that day. I later wished I had not. He answered quickly. I assume you saw it. I did. I told the truth. Did you? You kept records after leaving. I retained authorized copies connected to work I performed. That's your distinction. It's not mine. It's the distinction. See, this is what I mean. What exactly did Lydia tell you was happening? That Mercer is treating your file comparisons like some kind of evidence. They are evidence of version sequence. You hear yourself? Yes. You're acting like a prosecutor. No, Dad. I'm acting like someone whose professional reputation you just inserted into your daughter's contract dispute. I was asked about your history, and you volunteered a phrase designed to make normal record retention sound suspicious. Because it is suspicious. Then name one record I altered. He was silent. Name one. I didn't say you altered anything. Name one record I improperly obtained. Another silence. You always think if someone can't answer exactly the way you want, you've won. This isn't dinner. You submitted a written statement. Because Lydia needs someone to tell them what you're like. That sentence removed the last question I had. He was not confused. He was participating. I said, then make sure you are prepared to stand behind every word. Is that a threat? No, it's advice. You're threatening your own father now. I said nothing about consequences. I said be accurate. You are unbelievable. I know. I ended the call. Then I did something I had resisted doing from the beginning. I opened a new folder in my business records. I named it Franklin House Source Preservation. Not Lydia. Not family. Not wedding. The project. Inside it, I preserved the original email she had sent me, the attached exports, my response, my recap emails, Thomas's confirmations, and the written materials specifically shared with me. I did not add family texts unless they directly touched the professional allegation. I did not add wedding photographs. I did not add Dad's old insults. I did not write a manifesto. I preserved the record. That night, Grant texted me. I heard Dad sent something to Mercer about you. I didn't ask him to. I replied, I know. He wrote, I'm sorry. I stared at the words. Then typed, you don't need to apologize for him. Grant did not answer for almost an hour. When he did, the message was longer. I keep trying to separate the project from the family stuff. But every time I do, Lydia pulls you back into the explanation. I don't know what that means yet. I replied, then don't decide what it means yet. That was all. 2 days later, Thomas called. His voice was different from the beginning. Not hostile. More formal. Allison, I need to make sure you're somewhere you can talk. I'm in my office. Good. I put down the pen in my hand. What happened? We received a supplemental response from Lydia. I waited. She is now claiming the version history you sent me may have been constructed from old copies in a way that falsely suggests intentional removal. My jaw tightened. Constructed how? That is one of the things under review. I didn't send you an internal version history. I sent exports she emailed me. I know. The intermediate version came from your platform. I know. So is she alleging I fabricated something? She's alleging that the comparison and sequence you presented may be misleading and that your history of retaining older project records raises concerns about how the materials were selected. I stood. For the first time since this began, I wanted to call Lydia and scream. Not explain. Not reason. Scream. I wanted to ask how she could send me documents, ask for my judgment, ignore my warning, and then use the fact that I kept the documents she sent as evidence that I was untrustworthy. I wanted to ask Dad whether this was the daughter he was proud of. I wanted to send every email to Grant and let him sort through what his wife had become. I did none of those things. I walked once around my office and sat back down. Thomas. Yes? Is this now a formal allegation against my professional conduct? There was a pause. Yes. Something inside me became very still. Thomas continued, Lydia is now claiming the version history you sent me may have been constructed from old copies. I need you to treat this as a formal professional allegation. I looked at the folder I had created 2 days earlier. Understood. I suggest you notify whoever you need to notify on your side. I will. And Allison? Yes? Don't delete, rename, reorganize, or modify the source files. Despite everything, I almost smiled. I wouldn't dream of it. The call ended. I sat in silence for a moment, then opened the contact information for my professional liability carrier and the attorney my company used for risk matters. Lydia had spent weeks trying to turn a missing safety condition into a misunderstanding. Now she had made a different choice. She had put my name into the case. The first person I called after Thomas hung up was not my father, my mother, Grant, or Lydia. It was my attorney. Her name was Karen Mills, and she had handled contract language and professional risk questions for my consulting company for several years. I did not call her because I thought I was about to be sued. I called because once someone formally questioned my professional handling of project records, family history stopped being the relevant category. I had spent too many years watching my parents blur personal loyalty and business judgment to make the same mistake when the accusation finally landed on me. Karen listened without interrupting while I explained the sequence. Lydia had asked me for an outside second opinion. She had emailed me project extracts. I had identified a discrepancy between an engineering hold condition, an owner-facing summary, and the schedule. I had warned Lydia before escalating. Thomas had independently held the affected work. His review later found an intermediate owner summary version that still contained the hold language. Now, Lydia was suggesting that I had used old copies to construct a misleading version history. Karen's first question was simple. Do you have access to Mercer's project platform? No. Have you ever had access? No. Did you alter any attachment Lydia sent you? No. Did you rename them? No. Did you save them locally? Yes. Under the original file names? Yes. Good. Don't touch them. I wasn't planning to. I know. I'm saying it because now I need you to treat those files like evidence, not work product. That distinction settled me more than any reassurance could have. Karen asked me to preserve the original email from Lydia in its native form, including headers, not merely print it to PDF. She wanted the attachments preserved as received, my sent responses, Thomas's emails, and any communications directly relating to the allegation. She told me not to build a giant family archive just because I could. Do I include my father's texts? Do they address the documents or allegation? Some do. Then those specific ones. Not 20 years of Thanksgiving. Despite myself, I laughed. I don't have 20 years of Thanksgiving. Good. Keep it that way. She told me to notify my professional liability carrier that a circumstance had arisen which could potentially develop into a claim against my professional conduct. That did not mean admitting fault. It meant following the reporting requirements in my policy before someone else defined the situation for me. Within an hour, I had done both. The insurer asked for a concise description. I gave them one. I did not write, "My sister is lying about me because she hates being questioned." I wrote that a client-side project review had produced an allegation that source materials I received for limited outside review may have been presented misleadingly, that I denied altering or fabricating any material, and that the owner was conducting an independent platform audit. Facts. Nothing more. It felt almost comical that Lydia had spent years mocking me for turning everything into paperwork, and now paperwork was the only thing keeping her accusation from becoming whatever she wanted it to be. My next step was to verify my own source trail before anyone asked me to. I opened the original email from Lydia and checked its timestamp, sender information, attachment names, and file sizes. Then I checked the local copies I had preserved when I received them. They matched. I had not edited the content. I had not converted the files into new versions. The PDFs in my records were exactly what Lydia had sent. I took screenshots for my attorney, but did not manipulate the source files themselves. Then I stopped. That was important. I did not start trying to prove who had changed Mercer's internal documents. That was not my job, and I did not have access to the system where those documents lived. My job was narrower. Prove what I received. Prove when I received it. Prove what I said afterward. Protect my own record. That afternoon, Thomas sent me a request through the review contact asking whether I would provide a formal source statement. I agreed. The statement was painfully boring. I identified myself, my company, and the date Lydia contacted me. I stated that Lydia sent 3 project extracts to my business email for a limited outside review. I listed the file names. I stated that I had not been given credentials to the Mercer platform, had never logged into it, and had not uploaded, edited, or deleted any document within that workspace. I described the concern I communicated to Lydia, and the date I told her I would escalate if the hold remained unconfirmed. I identified the packet I later sent Thomas as copies of the documents Lydia had sent me, along with the associated email chain. At the end, I added one sentence. I make no representation as to who created, revised, renamed, or removed any document within Mercer Hospitality's project system because I had no access to that system. Karen read it before I sent it. Leave it exactly like that, she said. No opinions? You've already given the only opinion relevant to your role. Now you need to stay in your lane. That phrase would have infuriated me from almost anyone else. From Karen, it made me feel safer. 2 days later, Thomas called. We have the first access comparison. I sat down. What does that mean? Our platform administrator compared the internal project records with the files Lydia transmitted to you. And? The attachments in her sent email correspond to exported versions of records that existed in the workspace before she sent them. I said nothing. Thomas continued. Your email account did not have a user profile, guest credential, upload permission, or edit permission in the Franklin House environment. Okay. The intermediate summary, containing the hold language, was created in the platform before the timestamp of Lydia's email to you. I closed my eyes. And the final summary? Also before she sent you the exports. That was the point I had been waiting for without allowing myself to hope for it. The internal version sequence had existed before I ever received my copies. Whatever disagreement anyone wanted to have about interpretation, I could not have built that internal sequence after the fact. Thomas said, Do you understand why that matters? Yes. Tell me. Not because he needed an explanation. Because he wanted to know whether I would overstate it. It means the internal versions weren't created by me from the exports Lydia sent. Correct? It doesn't prove who made the changes. Correct. It doesn't prove intent. Correct. I heard something almost like approval in his silence. Then he said, That's where the review stands. Thank you. There may be another issue. Of course there was. What? William sent clarification regarding the statement he provided. I leaned back. What kind of clarification? He says he did not mean to imply that you altered records. I actually laughed. Thomas waited. Sorry. I assume there's context. My father is very good at stepping 3 inches backward after walking a mile. Thomas did not respond to that. I asked, What did he clarify? That when he described your history of retaining records, he meant only that you preserved copies after disagreements, and that he has no personal knowledge of you altering or fabricating project documents. That's accurate. He also says his concerns were about interpretation, not authenticity. Also accurate, if that's what he wants to say now. Do you want to respond? No. Thomas paused. Nothing? What would I add? He submitted the clarification. Then the record has it. That was one of the moments when I realized how much I had changed. 10 years earlier, I would have written Dad a paragraph explaining exactly why his original statement had been irresponsible. 5 years earlier, I might have called Mom and asked whether she understood what he had almost done to my career. Now I saw no value in either. Dad had put something in writing. Then, when it became clear the accusation might become testable instead of emotional, he narrowed it. That was information. I did not need to wrestle an apology out of him to make it real. He called me that evening anyway. I corrected the statement. I heard. You could at least acknowledge that. I just did. I told them I never said you falsified anything. You didn't. So we're done. No. His voice hardened. What does that mean? It means you don't get to decide when Mercer's review is done. I'm talking about us. Suenai. Allison, I was trying to answer a question. You were trying to help Lydia. She's my daughter. So am I. He went quiet. I regretted saying it almost immediately, not because it was false, but because it sounded like I was asking for something. I wasn't. I continued before he could turn it into an emotional negotiation. You wrote that my professional interpretation should be treated with caution because I retain records after disagreements. Now you've clarified that you've never known me to alter or fabricate records. Fine. I don't need anything else from you. You make everything sound so cold. I am keeping a professional allegation professional. This is family. Not anymore. He inhaled sharply. I heard my own words and realized how harsh they sounded, but I did not take them back. The second you submitted a written statement to my sister's client about my professional reliability, that part stopped being a family disagreement. I was defending her. Yes, that was the point. He had chosen, not between daughters, between evidence and the child whose version made him feel better about himself. He said, "You always think choices are that simple." No, I think consequences are often simpler than motives. That's one of those things you say because you like hearing yourself sound smart. There it was, the old escape hatch. If he could make my tone the problem, he would never have to address what I said. I ended the call. The next morning, Grant texted asking whether we could talk. He called during my lunch break. "I don't want details about the investigation," he said immediately. "Good." He almost laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I. I have one question." "Okay. Did you want my father to cancel Lydia's contract?" I looked down at the desk. "No." "Did you expect him to?" "No." "What did you want?" The hold verified before anyone worked under it. "That's it?" That's what I called him about. Grant was quiet. I added, "Once the work was held, the immediate thing I cared about was resolved." "Then why did you keep talking to him?" "Because his review started involving the files Lydia sent me. Then Lydia started involving my professional conduct." "Right." His voice sounded tired. I asked, "Why are you asking?" "Because Lydia says this was always about taking something away from her. I can't help what she says my motive was." "I know. Do you?" He exhaled. "I'm trying to." I waited. Grant said, "She keeps saying you couldn't stand watching her get the Mercer contract after leaving your dad's company." I almost laughed again, but there was nothing funny in it. "I left Dad's company 8 years ago." "I know. I have my own clients." "I know. I wasn't even involved in Franklin House until Lydia emailed me asking for help." "I know that too." "Then what exactly would I have been jealous of before she contacted me?" Grant did not answer. I regretted the sharpness of the question almost immediately. Not because he did not deserve to hear it. Because he was not Lydia. I softened my voice. "Grant, I'm not asking you to believe me because I'm her sister. I know. Check whatever can be checked." That's starting to sound familiar. "What is?" "The way you talk about her." I frowned. "I don't understand." "She says you're always looking for a record, a timestamp, somebody to confirm what happened." "That's true." "She says it's because you don't trust anyone." "Sometimes that's true too." That answer surprised him. I could hear it. I continued. "I can be rigid. I can decide someone isn't worth another conversation too quickly. I keep records because that's part of my work. But also because I don't like arguing about memory. Lydia isn't inventing every flaw I have. Then how do I know which parts she is inventing?" "You don't ask me." He went quiet. "You ask the facts." Grant let out a long breath. "That's what my dad keeps saying." Then listen to him. We ended the call without discussing his marriage. I was grateful for that. I did not want to become the person Grant called every time Lydia said something he doubted. That would have created its own unhealthy triangle, and I had no interest in joining one. The professional review kept moving. A day later, Karen forwarded me a technical summary from Mercer's review team that had been shared because it directly addressed the allegation against me. It confirmed what Thomas had already said. My copies matched the exports Lydia sent. The internal summary versions predated my receipt. My business email had never been granted platform access. Then one line near the end caught my attention. Post-review activity identified on archived working document. I called Karen. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it says." "That's not helpful." "It means they found an action after the review started." "We don't know what yet." "Do we ask?" "No." "Why?" "Because you're not the investigator." I hated when she was right. I waited. The answer came the following afternoon. Thomas called me himself. We identified an archived working copy of the owner's summary that was renamed after the review began. I sat up. Renamed how? The previous file name identified it as a hold-inclusive owner summary draft. The later classification labeled it as an internal draft not intended for distribution. I felt my pulse change. When? After the wedding. After you had already asked Lydia's firm for a version explanation. Yes. Who did it? The action occurred in a Lydia-authenticated session on a device registered to her. I stopped him. That doesn't prove she physically did it. No. I appreciated that he said it immediately. Shared device? Not listed as shared. But technically possible. Technically. What does Lydia say? We haven't completed that conversation. I looked at the wall. Then all you know is that the file was renamed through her authenticated session after the review started. Correct. Don't send me anything else, unless it directly concerns the allegation against me. Understood. I hung up. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried not to think about the rename. I failed. The timing was the problem. If someone was simply cleaning up project files, why do it after an investigation had started into those exact versions? But that was inference, not proof. I had spent weeks insisting on that distinction when it protected Lydia. I was not going to abandon it now because the facts had become convenient for me. That evening, Mom called. I answered against my better judgment. Your father says Mercer cleared you. They confirmed I didn't have platform access. Good. So this can end. No. Why not? Because the project review isn't about me. It became about you. Because Lydia made it about me. She was scared. I closed my eyes. Mum, you don't understand what she's under. I understand exactly what happens when people are under pressure. They make decisions. She thought she was losing everything. That doesn't give her my career to use as a shield. She's your sister. That did not seem to matter at the wedding. Are you really never going to let that go? It's been 2 weeks. You know what I mean. I did. She meant I was supposed to let it go before anyone else had to become uncomfortable about it. I said, I'm not discussing Lydia's marriage, business, or wedding with you. Then what are we supposed to talk about? That question hurt more than I expected. Because beneath all the manipulation, there was something true inside it. My mother and I had built so little outside the family system that once I refused to discuss Lydia, there was almost nothing left. I don't know, I said. She was silent. So was I. Then she whispered, I don't want to lose both of you. I almost softened. Almost. But I had heard versions of that sentence before. What it usually meant was, don't make me choose between peace and truth. I said, then stop asking one daughter to disappear so the other one can feel safe. She ended the call soon after. The next morning, Thomas emailed. The subject line was, Review Update. My stomach tightened before I opened it. Allison, this update is limited to an issue relevant to the allegation concerning your source materials. We questioned Lydia regarding the archived file activity. She acknowledged personally renaming and reclassifying the file after the review had begun. Her explanation is that she was cleaning up inconsistent draft labels and did not alter the document's substantive content. I read it slowly. Then again, the audit log had not proven Lydia personally touched the file. Lydia had. She had admitted it. Below that, Thomas added one sentence. We are evaluating the timing and purpose of the change in the context of the broader review. I leaned back in my chair. For weeks, Lydia had argued that I created a misleading story from old copies. Now, after accusing me of manipulating a version narrative, she had admitted changing the classification of one of the key archived files after the investigation began. Maybe she would have an innocent explanation. Maybe cleanup was exactly what she believed she had been doing. But for the first time since this started, the strongest evidence against Lydia was no longer something I had found. It was something she had done after she knew people were looking. Thomas did not call me the day he made his final decision about Lydia's contract. He sent the decision through the same controlled channel his company had used throughout the review, with only the sections relevant to the source materials I had provided and the allegation Lydia had made against me. By then, I appreciated that boundary. I did not need to see every interview, every internal discussion, or every sentence written by Mercer's attorneys. I needed to know what affected my professional record and what had been concluded about the work that started all of this. The letter was careful. Mercer Hospitality was terminating Reed Project Group's direct work package for loss of confidence in project reporting, concerns regarding document integrity, and the unexplained timing of post-review file reclassification. It did not call Lydia a criminal. It did not accuse her of intentionally trying to injure anyone. It did not claim that the building had ever been minutes from collapse. It said something much harder for Lydia to argue with. Mercer no longer trusted her company to manage information accurately enough for the role it had been hired to perform. I read the section about the renamed file twice. Lydia had admitted she personally changed the classification after the review had started. Her explanation remained that she was cleaning up inconsistent draft labels and had not changed the substantive content of the document. Mercer acknowledged that the text inside the archived draft had not been altered during that later action. The problem was the context. The old name identified the file as a hold-inclusive owner summary draft. The new classification made it look like an internal draft that had never been intended for owner distribution. That change happened after Lydia already knew Mercer was asking why the hold language had disappeared between versions. The letter stopped short of claiming her purpose. It did not need to go further. Trust had already collapsed. I forwarded the relevant section to Karen and called her. She read while I waited. "Well," she said finally, "your part is cleaner." Cleaner isn't the word I'd use. Professionally, it is. They specifically rejected the idea that you created their internal version history. Yes. They confirmed you had no platform access. Yes. They confirmed your copies matched the exports Lydia sent you. Yes. And now the person who accused you of presenting a misleading version trail has admitted changing the classification of a central file after review began. When you say it like that, it sounds bad. It is bad. I rubbed my forehead. I thought I'd feel better. Karen was quiet for a moment. About being cleared? About her finally getting caught doing something she couldn't explain away as my personality. Those are different things. I know. You were cleared because the records cleared you. What happens to your sister is not part of that. That was exactly the kind of sentence I paid Karen to say when I was too emotionally involved to trust myself. I don't want to become the person celebrating this. Then don't. That's it? That's it. I laughed once. You're expensive for someone who keeps telling me obvious things. And yet you keep calling. I ended the call in a better mood than I had started it. The next person who called was Grant. He did not sound angry. He sounded exhausted. "Can you talk?" "Yes." I moved out. I sat down. I had known their marriage was under strain. That did not mean I had expected to hear those words less than 3 weeks after the wedding. "I'm sorry. I'm not calling for sympathy." "Okay. I'm calling because I don't want you hearing it from somebody else and thinking I did it because my dad canceled Lydia's contract." I waited. Grant continued. "The contract was part of it. Not because it was canceled. Because of how she handled everything after." I did not ask him to explain. He did anyway. I asked her why she accused you of manipulating the files. What did she say? That she knew what you were capable of. My hand tightened around the phone. Grant said, I asked what evidence she had. And she said I was missing the point. I looked out my office window. I had heard that phrase in different forms my entire life. Evidence was never the point when the evidence was inconvenient. Grant, I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. I just needed to tell someone who would understand why that answer bothered me. I understand. Then she told me the rename was just housekeeping. I asked why she did housekeeping on that particular file after Dad's review started. I said nothing. Grant continued. She said she was tired of everyone treating normal project management like a conspiracy. I asked why she didn't just leave the file alone. What did she say? That she didn't think it mattered. His voice broke slightly on the last word. I felt no satisfaction. Whatever Lydia had done to me, Grant had married her, believing he understood who she was. I knew what it felt like to realize someone else's version of reality had been standing between you and the facts. He said, I keep thinking about the wedding. Why? The only child thing. I closed my eyes. Grant. I know, different issue. Yes. Except it isn't anymore. That was the part I could not argue with. He continued. First, she told me you were basically gone. Then I learned you lived with her until she was 10 and came back after college. She told me you refused family photos. You didn't. She told me you were trying to ruin the Mercer contract. You had warned her before you called Dad. Then she said you might have manipulated documents, and now there is no evidence you ever had access to the system. That doesn't prove everything she's ever told you is false. I know. His voice sharpened unexpectedly. I know that, Allison. I am trying very hard not to become the person who hears one lie and decides the whole marriage was fake. I let the silence settle. Then I said, "That's probably wise." He laughed bitterly. You know what's strange? What? Every time I ask you to condemn her, you don't. I'm not married to her. No. And I don't want responsibility for what you decide. I know. There was another pause. I moved into a furnished apartment for now. I'm going to give myself space before I make anything permanent. That sounds reasonable. Lydia thinks Dad turned me against her. Did he? No. Then don't argue about the person she blames. Decide based on what you know. Grant breathed out slowly. That's what Dad said. Then apparently we agree on one thing. He ended the call a few minutes later. I did not tell my parents Grant had moved out. I did not call Lydia. I did not tell Aunt Susan. For nearly 2 days, I let the consequences belong to the people living them. Then Mom invited me to a family meeting. Her text read, "We cannot keep doing this separately. Please come Sunday. Your father and Lydia will be here." I stared at it. My first instinct was no. That would have been the easiest answer. I did not owe them a family summit. I did not need to sit in my parents' living room while Dad explained why his intentions mattered more than his statement, and Lydia explained why fear excused what she had done. Then I asked myself why I wanted to refuse. Partly because I did not trust them. Partly because I was tired. And partly because I liked the clean finality of cutting people off before they could disappoint me again. That last part belonged to me. I replied, "I'll come once. I'm not discussing Mercer's confidential review beyond what directly concerns me, and I'm not negotiating anyone's marriage." Mom responded with a heart. I almost canceled. Sunday afternoon, I drove to the house where Lydia and I had both grown up, which made her wedding claim feel even more absurd. The front hallway still had the marks in the wood trim where Dad measured our heights when we were children. Mine climbed first. Lydia's started lower and eventually passed the point where I had left for college. Our names were still written beside them in faded pen. Only child. I walked past the marks without touching them. Mom met me in the living room. Dad sat in his usual chair. Lydia was on the sofa. She looked different. Not ruined. Not broken. Just tired. There was something important about seeing that. Stories make consequences look dramatic because drama is easy to recognize. Real consequences often look like a woman sitting in her parents' house wearing leggings and no makeup, while a phone she has stopped trusting lies face down beside her. Mom said, "Thank you for coming." I sat in the chair farthest from Lydia. "What's the goal?" Mom winced. "Can we not make this formal?" "Then tell me why I'm here." Dad said, "Because this family is falling apart." I looked at him. "It didn't happen this month." "Here we go." "No. You invited me." Lydia spoke for the first time. "Grant moved out." "I know." Her eyes snapped toward me. "He told you?" "Yes. Of course he did. I didn't ask him to." "You didn't have to." Dad said. "Lydia." She ignored him. "You got everything." I stared at her. What did I get? My contract is gone. Grant left. Mercer is acting like I'm some kind of criminal. Dad is blaming me. Employees are asking questions. What exactly are you still waiting for? I felt anger rise. Then something colder replaced it. You think I caused all of those things? You called Thomas. After warning you, you knew what would happen. No. I knew the work needed verification. You knew his family would turn against me. I asked him not to involve Grant. She laughed. How generous. Mom said, "Please. We are not going to get anywhere if everyone keeps attacking." I looked at her. "I haven't attacked anyone." Lydia leaned forward. You sent documents to my client. Documents you sent me. You made them look suspicious. They found the internal versions on their own system. You knew exactly what you were doing. No, Lydia, that's the problem. You keep deciding what everyone meant, instead of dealing with what they did. Her face hardened. You've always thought you're better than me. There it was. Not safer. Not more accurate. Better. I answered carefully. I've thought I was better than you at some things. Mom looked horrified. Dad almost smiled, as if I had finally admitted the crime. I continued. And you've been better than me at some things. You read rooms better. You sell better. Clients like you faster. You are better at making people feel calm. I can be blunt. I can be rigid. Sometimes I decide people aren't worth another conversation before I've actually tried to understand them. Lydia stared at me. But none of that put the hold language back into the summary. None of that gave me access to Mercer's platform. None of that made you accuse me without evidence. You always have an answer. No, I have a boundary. Dad shifted. What does that mean? It means my flaws are mine. Her choices are hers. Stop using one to explain the other. Lydia stood. You want to talk about choices? Mom said her name quietly. Lydia did not sit down. She grabbed her phone. Fine. She scrolled for several seconds, then looked at Dad. Should I show her? Dad's expression changed. I noticed immediately. Show me what? Dad said. This isn't relevant. Lydia laughed. Of course it's relevant. Lydia. She held the phone toward me. It was an old text exchange. Not years old. Weeks. Before the final owner summary. I read Lydia's message first. Engineering wants another hold. If I put this into the owner update the way they wrote it, Mercer will stop the schedule again. Then Dad's response. Don't hand the client a reason to panic before you know it's real. Keep the technical debate internal and manage the job. I read it twice. Mom whispered. William? Dad stood. That does not say remove anything. Lydia turned on him. No. You never say the ugly part. Watch yourself. You say, manage it. You say, don't alarm the client. You say, keep things moving. Then when it goes bad, suddenly everyone was supposed to know the line you meant. I told you to manage the job. I did not tell you to falsify a report. I didn't falsify the engineering report. You removed a warning from the owner summary. Lydia's eyes flashed. And where do you think I learned that the warning was the problem? Dad stared at her. She kept going. Do you remember Allison's project? His face tightened. Don't drag that into this. You dragged it into everything. I sat very still. For the first time, I was not the person explaining what had happened 8 years earlier. Lydia was. You talked about it for years, she said. How Allison panicked. How she cost you a client. How she didn't understand business. Every time she stopped something, you called her difficult. Every time I kept something moving, you told me I had instincts. Dad's voice rose. I told you how to run a company. You taught me what happened when someone became Allison. That sentence landed harder than anything else in the room. Mom sat down slowly. Dad pointed toward Lydia. You made your own decisions. After you spent half my life telling me which daughter was doing it right, I never told you to change that file after the investigation started. Lydia flinched. No. And I never told you to accuse Allison. No. Then don't stand there and pretend this is mine. Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in it. You wanted a daughter who wasn't Allison. Dad's face changed. I wanted a daughter who could handle pressure. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. You got one. Nobody spoke. It would have been easy then to enjoy the collapse. Dad had spent years holding Lydia up as proof that his way worked. Lydia had spent years benefiting from it. Now she was using his praise as evidence against him. I felt no victory, just recognition. Mom finally said, This is getting us nowhere. I looked at her. No. This is probably the first honest conversation you've had about it. She turned toward me. Please don't make this worse. I almost smiled. You still think I'm the person controlling what happens next. Dad looked at me. Well? You heard her. I frowned. Heard what? She just admitted I influenced her. Lydia turned on him. I said more than that. Dad ignored her. Now you understand what happened. I stared at him. It took me a second to realize what he wanted. He wanted me to absolve him because Lydia had blamed him. He wanted me to choose his side. You think this makes you the victim. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Allison, she is trying to put her decisions on me. Some of them were hers. Dad's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I continued. And some of the thinking underneath them came straight from you. His face hardened again. So you're taking her side? No. Lydia looked at me. Dad said, You just said. I said 2 things can be true. I stood. Dad taught you that bad news was something to manage before it frightened a client. He taught you that stopping a project meant weakness. He spent years treating my caution like a character flaw. I looked at Lydia, but he did not make you remove the warning. Her face tightened. He did not make you accuse me. She looked away. He did not make you rename a file after the review started. That wasn't. You admitted doing it. It was cleanup. Then own the cleanup. She stared at me. I continued. He taught you something bad. You chose to keep using it. Dad said, So what? I'm responsible for everything. I turned to him. No. That's the part neither of you understands. Responsibility is not a pie. Her having some does not leave less for you. Mom stood. We are still a family. I looked around the room. At Dad. At Lydia. At the old staircase beyond them. At the house where 2 daughters had grown up. I know. Mom's face softened. Then I added, That's why what happened matters. She looked wounded. I did not apologize. Lydia folded her arms. You're enjoying this. No. You finally get to be right. I was right about the hold condition. That doesn't make this enjoyable. Don't pretend you didn't want Dad to see what I am. Dad reacted before I did. Now I see. Lydia turned on him. See? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Dad looked at me. You see what she is now. That sentence was supposed to recruit me. The old family structure had changed sides but not shape. Dad wanted the difficult daughter back because the golden one had stopped protecting him. I picked up my bag. I saw what she chose. Dad nodded sharply. Then I said, and I saw who taught her, which choices deserved praise. His expression collapsed. So you're defending her? No. I looked at Lydia. I'm not defending you either. Mom stepped toward me. Then what are you doing? Leaving. Dad laughed bitterly. Of course. I looked at him. No. This time I'm not leaving because nobody will listen. I'm leaving because I heard all of you. Lydia followed me into the hallway. Allison. I stopped near the front door. She kept several feet between us. At least now you know I didn't invent this. I looked past her toward the marks on the doorframe. 2 names. 2 childhoods. 1 family that had spent years pretending one version could erase the other. Then I looked at my sister. No, I said. But you perfected it. I opened the door and walked out. The week after I walked out of my parents' house, nothing exploded. That was almost disappointing in its normality. Lydia's company did not vanish overnight. Nobody marched her out of an office. There were no police, no viral videos, no dramatic public confession. Mercer had terminated her direct work package, and that consequence began spreading the way professional damage usually does. Quietly, through questions other people suddenly wanted answered. I learned only what reached me legitimately. Lydia herself complained to Mom that one client had paused a renewal until the Mercer dispute was clearer. 2 employees left within the next few weeks. Because Mercer's termination letter identified a potential professional claim involving document integrity, Lydia's firm had to notify its liability carrier under the policy. The insurer opened a review. None of that meant Lydia had been declared guilty of a crime. It meant people who had once accepted her explanations without hesitation were starting to verify them. That was the thing she hated most. She called me once. I almost did not answer. Then I remembered something I had admitted to myself during the family meeting. Cutting people off quickly was sometimes a strength. Sometimes it was simply the easiest way to avoid hearing something uncomfortable. So I answered. What? She laughed bitterly. Good to hear your compassion survived. You called me. My insurance company wants records. Then give them records. A client wants to know whether Mercer terminated us over safety. What did Mercer say? You know what they said. I know what they told me about the allegation involving my source documents. I don't have your full termination file. You really love saying that. Saying what? That you don't know things. I've learned it's better than pretending I do. She went silent. Then she said, We may lose another account. I did not answer. What? She asked. Nothing? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Maybe that you didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't call Thomas hoping you would lose clients. But you knew that could happen. I knew the owner might stop the work until the hold was verified. You keep hiding behind that. No. I keep returning to it because that's why I acted. Lydia exhaled sharply. You still think this is all about one missing sentence? No. That stopped her. I continued. It stopped being about one missing sentence when you decided the person who noticed it was more dangerous than the omission. You really rehearsed that one. I didn't need to. She went quiet again. Then, softer, Dad won't talk to me. I had not expected that. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing. Then why tell me? I don't know. For a few seconds, she sounded less like the woman who had tried to attach professional suspicion to my name and more like the sister I had once known. That was the hardest part of boundaries. They did not erase history. They only stopped history from becoming permission. I said, You were right about one thing at Mom and Dad's. What? Dad taught you a lot of what you believed about bad news. She breathed in. Then I added, And you were wrong if you think that means he made your decisions. Her voice hardened again. So we're back to that. We never left it. She ended the call. I did not call back. Grant contacted me less often after he moved out. I was grateful. I did not want our relationship to become an alliance against Lydia. Near the end of July, he called once. I filed. I knew what he meant. For divorce? Yes. I sat quietly for a moment. I'm sorry. I know you are. There were no children, which made some parts simpler, but nothing about ending a marriage after 6 weeks was actually simple. Grant had spoken with an attorney first. Filing was only the beginning. There would be paperwork, waiting, negotiation, and whatever private grief happened between two people who had stood in front of everyone they loved and promised permanence less than 2 months earlier. I asked, Are you sure you want me knowing this? Yes. Because I don't want your mother telling you I did it because your family embarrassed me. Did she say that? Not to me. I almost smiled. Then how do you know? I've learned to recognize the shape of the story before she finishes telling it. That sentence sounded too much like something I might have said. Grant continued, I didn't file because Lydia had a bad project. I didn't even file because she lied about you once. I said nothing. I filed because every time something contradicted her version, she changed the explanation instead of admitting the version was wrong. That was his conclusion. Not mine. I respected him enough not to improve it. He said, I'm not telling you because I want you to feel vindicated. I don't. I know. We talked for another minute, then hung up. I did not tell my parents. By then, I had stopped volunteering information simply because I possessed it. Dad tried a different approach. He called one evening and said, Lydia is telling relatives I taught her to hide information from clients. Did you? Of course not. Then tell them that. I already did. Okay, that's it? What else do you want? I want you to tell her I never told her to remove that warning. You didn't. He sounded relieved. Then I added, You did tell her not to give the client a reason to panic and to keep the technical debate internal. His tone changed instantly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Taking something normal and making it sound sinister? I didn't call it sinister. You know what you imply. Dad, I don't need to imply anything anymore. I heard both of you. You know I never meant for her to do what she did. I believe you. That silenced him. I did believe him. William Reed had not sat down and designed a cover-up with Lydia. That version would have been emotionally convenient and factually wrong. He had done something more ordinary. He had spent years teaching one daughter that caution was weakness, and the other that speed was competence. He had rewarded Lydia for making problems feel smaller. He had punished me for making them visible. Then he had been surprised when Lydia carried that lesson farther than he intended. He said, "Then why are you still blaming me?" "I'm not blaming you for her edits." "Then what?" "I'm holding you responsible for what was yours." He groaned. "You always need everything divided into categories. Sometimes categories help. Family doesn't work that way." "No. That's why this took so long." He ended the call angrily. I did not feel guilty. That was new. Mom lasted another 4 days before asking me to come over. I said no. She did not push for a meeting. Instead, she came to my house. I almost refused to let her in. Then I opened the door. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a glass of water she barely touched. "Your father and Lydia aren't speaking." "I know. Grant filed for divorce." "I know." Her eyes lifted. "He told you?" "Yes." She looked hurt by that, as if Grant's decision to tell me something about his own life were another theft from Lydia. Mom said, "This family is being destroyed." I leaned back. "I don't agree." Her face tightened. "How can you say that?" "Because destruction implies one event did this." "Then what do you call it?" "Exposure." She looked down at the glass. "Allison, I'm not trying to be dramatic. You don't have to try." That almost made me smile. She continued. "People at the wedding have been asking questions. Susan called me. Your uncle called your father. Everyone knows something happened. Something did. I want this to stop." "What does stopping look like?" She hesitated. There it was. The dangerous question. Not what she felt. What she wanted me to do. Could you tell people Lydia didn't literally mean she had no sister? I stared at her. She literally said she grew up an only child. "You know what I mean." "No." "Tell me." Mom's eyes filled. She meant she felt alone. "Then she can tell people that. You could help." "Why me?" "Because people know you were hurt." I was. "Exactly. So you want the person who was publicly erased to explain why the person who erased her didn't really mean it." Mom flinched. "When you put it like that, that's how it is." She looked toward the window. "I don't want everyone judging her forever over one sentence. This isn't about forever." "Then what do you want?" The answer came easily. "Correction." She looked back at me. "What?" "You and Dad confirmed what Lydia said in front of those people. If you believe it was wrong, correct it." Her face went pale. "Publicly?" "To the people who heard it." That would humiliate her. I sat very still. There it was again. The family principle. Harm could happen publicly. Correction had to happen privately. Otherwise, the correction was considered the humiliation. I said, "Mom, you think the embarrassing part is people knowing you lied?" She shook her head. "Don't call it that." "What should I call it?" "Un terrible moment." "No." Her eyes narrowed. "I am trying." I know. That was true too. She was trying within the only system she understood. Repair the feeling. Blur the fact. Keep everyone at the table. I continued. The humiliating part wasn't people seeing what happened. It was what happened. She started crying quietly. I hated that I did not immediately move to comfort her. That sounds cold. Maybe it was. But too many conversations in my family had ended the same way. Mom cried. Dad became protective. Lydia became fragile. And whatever started the conversation disappeared. I passed her a tissue. I did not change the answer. Mom wiped her eyes. "What do you expect us to say?" "The truth." "Which is?" "That I'm your daughter, Lydia's sister." And what was said at the wedding was false. She stared at me. "That's it?" "That's it. You don't want an apology?" "I didn't say that." "But you don't need one?" I thought about it. No. That surprised both of us. I did not need Dad to say he had been a terrible father. I did not need Mom to confess she had chosen Lydia. I did not need Lydia to admit she had always envied something about me. I needed them to stop asking me to participate in false versions of events. Mom stood to leave. At the door, she turned. "You're not coming back if we don't do this, are you?" I considered the question. "I'm not going back to how things were. That's not what I asked. It is the only answer I have." She nodded once and left. 3 days later, I opened my inbox before work. There was an email from my father. Mom was copied. Lydia was not. The subject line said, "About what we said at the wedding." I stared at it for several seconds before I opened it. The email from Dad was shorter than I expected. For most of my life, William Reed could turn a 5-minute disagreement into an hour if he believed there was still a chance to win. He repeated himself with different emphasis, changed examples when the first one stopped working, and treated exhaustion like agreement. This time, there were only 6 sentences. Mom was copied. So were Aunt Susan, 2 of my uncles, several cousins, and most of the relatives who had been sitting close enough at the wedding reception to hear Lydia say she had grown up an only child and watch Dad stand up to confirm it. The subject line read, "About what we said at the wedding." Dad wrote that something said during the reception needed to be corrected. He stated plainly that I was his and Mom's daughter, that I was Lydia's older sister, and that the suggestion Lydia had grown up as an only child was false. He said the family had been under strain and that he should not have reinforced that statement publicly. It was not an apology. Not really. There was no explanation of why he had stood up so fast. No admission that the words had been intended to diminish me. No acknowledgement of the years he had spent describing Lydia as the daughter who understood people and business while I was the one who made everything harder. Then Mom added one sentence beneath his. "We are sorry that Allison was put in that position." Put in that position. My mother had always loved passive voice when responsibility became uncomfortable. Nobody made the family photo exclusive. It became simpler. Nobody excluded me from conversations. Things got complicated. Nobody erased me at the wedding. I was put in a position. I stared at that sentence for a while. A year earlier, I would have called her. I would have asked who had put me there. I would have wanted her to say Lydia's name, Dad's name, maybe even her own. I would have measured the correction against everything it failed to confess. Instead, I read the email one more time and archived it. I did not delete it. I still kept records. That part of me had not changed, and I no longer considered it something I needed to apologize for. But I did not pin the email to the top of my inbox either. I did not print it. I did not forward it with a message saying, "Finally, the correction existed. That was enough." Aunt Susan texted me less than 10 minutes later. I should have said something that night. I replied, "You don't owe me a speech." She answered, "Still, I knew what she meant." Several other messages followed over the next few hours. One cousin apologized for staring at me after Lydia's speech, without saying anything. Another admitted she had assumed Lydia was speaking figuratively, because the alternative had seemed too strange to process in real time. One of my uncles said he had believed there must be some piece of family history he did not know, because surely nobody would make a statement that absurd with the supposed non-existent sister sitting 10 feet away. That was the useful thing about an obvious lie. It often survived because decent people assumed context was missing before they assumed someone was lying. I answered the messages I wanted to answer. I ignored the ones that felt like invitations to gossip. I did not tell anybody about Mercer's review. I did not send screenshots of Lydia's texts. I did not explain that Grant had moved out or that he was talking to an attorney. Correcting one public lie did not give me permission to make every private consequence public. That distinction mattered to me more than revenge ever had. For years, my family had accused me of collecting facts so I could use them against people. I finally understood that possessing information and weaponizing it were two different choices. A week after Dad's correction, Lydia called. I watched her name on my phone until the 3rd ring. Then I answered. "What?" She gave a bitter laugh. "Good to know you've become warm and forgiving." "You called me." "I know. What do you need?" There was a pause. Even then, after everything, she disliked direct questions. "Can we meet?" "No." "Allison." "You asked." I answered. She went quiet again. "Can you at least hear what I need?" "Yes." Her voice shifted into the tone she used with clients when she was trying to turn a difficult discussion into a solvable problem. One of our clients is deciding whether to keep us on a smaller project. I waited. They know about Mercer. Okay. They've seen part of the termination language. That makes sense. They want clarification. Then clarify. That's why I'm calling. I leaned back in my chair. What do they want from me? She hesitated just long enough to tell me there was already wording. A statement about your original concern. What kind of statement? Nothing dramatic. Just confirmation that the documents could reasonably have been interpreted differently. I thought about that. They could have? She sounded surprised. Exactly. The interpretation of intent could have been different. Right. The existence of the hold condition wasn't open to interpretation. Her silence returned. Allison, what exactly do you want under my name? I'll send it. Send it. The email arrived 5 minutes later. The proposed statement was 1 paragraph. That was the dangerous part. It was not an obvious lie. Obvious lies are easy to refuse. The paragraph said that my initial concern arose from differing professional interpretations of how technical hold language should be reflected in owner-level reporting. I read it twice. Then I opened the original engineering note again. The hold condition was there. I opened the summary Lydia had sent me. The condition was absent. Then I opened the schedule extract that had shown the affected work moving into the Tuesday sequence without a clear release milestone. My concern had not arisen because 2 professionals preferred different writing styles. It had arisen because information relevant to whether work could proceed had disappeared between one document and another, while the schedule still moved forward. The proposed paragraph would not deny that directly. It would blur it. That was the entire strategy. I called Lydia. I won't sign this. She answered immediately. Why? Because it isn't accurate. It is accurate. No. It says my concern originated from a difference in professional interpretation. It did. No. Our disagreement about the meaning of the omission came afterward. The concern originated because the hold existed in the engineering note and wasn't visible in the owner summary. You're splitting hairs. I'm reading the sentence you want attached to my professional name. Nobody is asking you to lie. I'm not signing it. Her breathing became audible. Do you understand what this could cost me? Yes. No, you don't. I understand a client may walk. We could lose more than one. Then you need to handle that with your counsel and your insurer. This could cost people their jobs. I know. People with families. I know. Mortgages. I know. And you can sit there and say no? That one landed harder. Because consequences rarely stop neatly at the person who caused them. Employees who had never seen the owner's summary could lose work. People who had no idea what Lydia and I had said to each other might have to update resumes. That was real. It was also not something I could fix by putting a misleading paragraph under my name. I said, I can live with refusing to sign something inaccurate. You always find a way to sound righteous. I'm not trying to. Then help me. I did. When? The first time you sent me the files. She did not answer. I continued. You asked for 10 minutes. You asked whether you were reading the engineer too conservatively. I gave you the answer you didn't want. That's not help. It was exactly the help you asked for. You could help now, by changing the record, by giving context. Then, give your client the real context. They don't want a technical investigation. Then summarize it honestly. She laughed, but it sounded close to tears. You really are going to let this destroy me? No. That's exactly what you're doing. No. I'm finally letting your choices belong to you. She went silent. I expected her to yell. Instead, she said, Do you know what Dad is doing? What? He barely talks to me. I closed my eyes. I can't fix that. He blames me for everything. I don't. Don't you? No. That seemed to confuse her. I think Dad taught you things about business that made this easier for you to justify. I think he spent years rewarding you for making problems feel smaller. I think he punished me for making them visible. She breathed in slowly. And I think you still made the choices. So we're back to that. We never left it. Her voice hardened. You really need everyone responsible for exactly their percentage, don't you? No. Responsibility isn't a percentage. Sounds like it. I think Dad can be responsible for what he taught you, and you can be responsible for what you did with it. Neither cancels the other. She did not respond. Then she hung up. I sat in my office for almost an hour afterward, feeling terrible. Not guilty. Terrible. There is a difference. Setting a boundary does not always feel empowering. Sometimes it feels like knowing you could make another person's immediate problem smaller if you were willing to make the truth less precise. For the first time, I understood my mother better. Not agreed with her. Understood her. Blur the fact. Lower the temperature. Move everyone toward the next dinner. Call the reduction of pain a solution. It was tempting. I still refused it. 3 days later, Dad appeared at my office without calling first. My receptionist came to my door and said, "There's a man out front asking for you." I knew who it was before I stood. Dad was in the waiting area with his hands in his pockets. He looked older than he had at the wedding. 5 minutes, I said. He followed me into the small conference room. I heard Lydia asked you for a statement. Of course you did. She shouldn't have. That surprised me. Dasat. She needs to stop making things worse. I agree. He looked at me as though he had expected resistance. I told her not to contact you again about the business. Okay. I told her she has to deal with her clients herself. Good. He nodded. Then waited. There was always a second reason with Dad. Finally, he said, "You think I'm enjoying any of this?" No. You think I wanted her company damaged? No. You think I wanted Grant to leave? No. His jaw tightened. Then stop looking at me like I did. I almost smiled. Dad, you're arguing with an expression I haven't made. You blame me. I think you contributed. Same thing. No. There you go. What? Everything goes into categories with you. Lydia did this. I did that. Your mother did something else. Everybody gets assigned a piece. I leaned back. I used to want you to admit I was right about the project 8 years ago. He stopped. I know. I wanted you to tell me stopping the work had been right. I wanted you to correct the story you told people about why I left. Dad looked down at his hands. I wanted you to admit that nobody getting hurt wasn't proof I overreacted. It was partly the result of the work being stopped. He did not answer. I don't need that anymore. His eyes lifted. Because Mercer proved you right? No. Then why? Because whether you admit it has nothing to do with whether it happened. For once, he had no immediate reply. I continued. I also know I'm not easy. That got his attention. I can be cold. I can be impatient. Sometimes I decide a conversation is pointless too fast. Sometimes I am so focused on being precise that I forget there are actual people on the other side of the sentence. Dad stared at me. I've been wrong about tone. I've been wrong about people. I've been wrong about what somebody meant. He said nothing. But none of that changes the documents. He looked away. That sentence seemed to exhaust him. I'm not asking you to forgive Lydia. Good. I'm asking whether you're enjoying being proven right. No. I meant it. Dad searched my face. Then he nodded. After a moment, he said, I shouldn't have stood up at the wedding. I stayed still. No. I was angry. I know. I wanted her to have one day without all this. So did I. His expression changed. I believe you. That was probably the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. A year earlier, I would have pressed. Without all what? Why was my existence part of the problem? Why did Lydia's good day require my silence? Now I understood that forcing every confession did not make truth more true. Dad stood. At the door, he stopped. I don't know what happens with this family now. Neither do I. He looked disappointed by that answer. Maybe he had expected me to have a plan. I used to. Fix the story. Correct the record. Make people admit what they did. It had taken me 38 years to understand that sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is stop volunteering to manage consequences that do not belong to you. Mom came to my house the following weekend. She brought food. Of course she did. My mother had never known how to arrive empty-handed when she was frightened. We ate at my kitchen table. For 20 minutes, we talked about nothing that mattered. A neighbor had replaced a fence. One of my cousins was changing jobs. A restaurant Mom liked had closed. Then she put down her fork. The family will never be the same. No. Her eyes filled. I waited. Doesn't that make you sad? Yes. That surprised her. I continued. But I don't think it was the same before. What does that mean? We were agreeing not to say what was wrong. Mom looked down. I thought I was keeping everyone together. I know. I thought if people calmed down, they would forgive each other. Sometimes they do. And sometimes calming down just means the person who was hurt stops talking. Her eyes closed. I did that to you. I could have made her say more. I could have asked how many times. I could have listed examples. I did not. Yes. Mom nodded slowly. I don't know how to fix it. You don't have to fix everything. She gave me a sad smile. That's not something I ever thought I'd hear from you. She was right. A year earlier, I would have had a list. What Dad needed to correct. What Lydia needed to apologize for. What Mom needed to admit. Now I understood that managing everybody else's growth was just another form of control. Mom asked, "What happens with us?" I don't know. Do you want me out of your life? No. Her shoulders loosened slightly. But I don't want things going back to normal either. Her expression fell. Limited contact? For now. How limited? I don't know yet. She looked hurt. I did not soften the answer. But I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Limited was not nothing. It meant the relationship had to stop costing more than it contained. By August, the Franklin House project was moving again under a different project management team. Engineering had formally confirmed the required temporary support conditions. The hold had been released through the proper process, and the affected work proceeded. Nobody got hurt. That was still the outcome I cared about most. Lydia's company survived. It was smaller. She lost the Mercer work. At least one important client paused business. A couple of employees left. Her insurer had opened its review after the termination and professional allegation issues were reported. She was not bankrupt. She was not homeless. Her life did not end. It changed. That mattered because I never wanted the ending where Lydia became destitute just so I could feel vindicated. What I wanted was much simpler. Her choices had consequences she could no longer hand to somebody else. Grant's divorce filing was still moving through the legal process. He and Lydia remained separated, and I stayed out of the details. I had already heard his reasons, and I did not need to hear them again to understand that the marriage had not collapsed because of one bad project or one ugly wedding speech. What broke it was the pattern underneath both. Thomas and I never became friends. That was another ending I was grateful for. He did not turn me into his new consultant. He did not offer me some enormous contract because I had warned him. There was no fairy tale professional reward waiting on the other side of doing the right thing. When the portion of Mercer's review involving me officially closed, Thomas sent one final email. "Thank you for raising the issue in a way that allowed us to verify it." I replied, "Thank you for verifying it. That was enough." Near the end of August, I was searching my inbox for an unrelated client message when Dad's correction email appeared in the results. About what we said at the wedding. I opened it. For a few seconds, I was back in that ballroom. Lydia holding the microphone. Dad standing. Mom lifting her champagne glass. Relatives turning toward me because they knew I was sitting 10 feet away and did not know what rules they were expected to follow. My sister had said she grew up an only child. For years, a sentence like that would have sent me into battle. I would have wanted to tell everyone exactly where I had been. How long Lydia and I lived under the same roof. How many Christmas mornings we shared. How often she came to me when she needed something Dad could not give her. How she had emailed me for professional help only weeks before pretending I was barely part of her life. I would have wanted evidence for every inch of my existence. Now I understood something simpler. I did not need Lydia to call me her sister in order to prove I had been one. I had spent too much of my life believing silence was always strength. It wasn't. Sometimes silence was dignity. Sometimes it was avoidance. And sometimes silence simply left an empty space where the loudest person got to write history. I had been wrong about that, but the answer was not to become louder than Lydia. It was not to expose every private failure. It was not to make Grant hate her, destroy her company, or force my parents to confess every bad choice they had made. The answer was knowing which facts mattered enough to put on the record. A hold condition mattered. An allegation against my professional integrity mattered. A public statement that erased me from my own family mattered. Once those things were corrected, I did not have to spend the rest of my life prosecuting the people who had gotten them wrong. I archived Dad's email again. Not because I had stopped keeping evidence. I still kept everything that mattered. The difference was that I no longer needed that email sitting where I could reread it whenever I doubted myself. I already knew what happened. The documents existed. The witnesses existed. The correction existed. More importantly, my boundary existed. Lydia tried to make me disappear from one wedding speech. Dad helped her. Mom raised her glass. For a few seconds, they had the room. They had the microphone. They had the version of the family they wanted everyone to accept. But they never actually had the power to decide whether I existed. The only power I had given them was the power to make me argue about it. That was the part I finally took back. I did not punish them into admitting I was real. I did something harder. I stopped helping them pretend I wasn't. You do not have to stay silent just to keep your family comfortable. When someone rewrites the truth, protect yourself with clear records, calm boundaries, and facts you can verify. Give people a chance to correct their choices, but do not take responsibility for consequences they created. Loyalty should never require you to lie for someone else. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel for more.